Good afternoon. If people will take their seats, we can get started. On behalf of LaRouche PAC, I'd like to welcome everyone here in our live audience and those who are listening online. This process of seminars and addresses by Mr. LaRouche has become something that people here in Washington and internationally have become increasingly dependent upon as we struggle to make our way through this existential crisis facing not only our nation, but the world. As people know, today's event has been referred to with the title, The Ides of March. And I think that is very apt, not only because we're a couple of days before the Ides of March, but because of what the Ides of March in fact represents. And I think that, as most people know, until the year 44, the Ides of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March simply represented the 15th of the month of March on the Roman calendar. But when we talk about it, it represents something a little bit different, because it was indeed the day that Julius Caesar was murdered. Now, according to Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Caesar had been warned to be on guard against a great peril that was to strike him on the 15th of March. Now, Caesar, who obviously generally utilized soothsayers and seers, we can presume believed in them. Yet, despite what he was told, he made a decision to ignore the warning. The fact is that had he stayed home on that fateful day, he could have avoided what was his ultimate fate in the Roman Senate. But he chose to go anyway. And according to Plutarch, and also according to popular legend, it's said that he encountered that soothsayer for the last time, just before he entered the theater of Pompeii, where he would ultimately be assassinated. Okay. And Caesar, who was an arrogant fellow, looked over to the soothsayer and said to him, "Well, the Ides of March have come." And the seer looked at him and replied, "Aye, they have come, Caesar, but they are not yet gone." Obviously, this meeting is dramatized most famously in Shakespeare's play, when Caesar is once again warned to beware the Ides of March. It's also noted that there was another incident that occurred on the Ides of March in 1917, when Nicholas II of Russia abdicated. And here we are again, coming up upon the Ides of March. And the question, I guess, before us is whether or not, this time around, the warning will be heeded. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further introduction, I'd like to introduce to you Lyndon Larouche.
Thank you, young lady. Thank you. Thank you. This is an unusual occasion, and I shall treat it such. We're now on the verge of not the loss, but the replacement of an incumbent president. Some people are talking about 2012. 2012 is code word for 2010. Yeah? And 2010 does not mean December, because the pace of developments is such today that it's doubtful that this person will be still president in April. It's that these kinds of things are not precisely predictable. What is forecastable and what is predictable are two different things. You can forecast a crisis, you can forecast the approximate timing of a crisis, but you cannot forecast precisely the reaction to the crisis or the way it will come about. But you can forecast, and forecast precisely, as I've done many times. But I warn people, you cannot forecast a date, a given fixed date for anything, because human beings aren't like that. Human society is not like that. There's always the element of the unexpected, but the unexpected event will be absorbed within the expected crisis. That is, you can try to change the date of a battle, but you may not be able to change the date of the losing of a war. So we cannot predict the date that certain things will happen as date certain, but we can predict that we're in a very narrow area in which this president's candidacy and presidency is doomed. Nothing will save this presidency and the present form. And the sooner he's gone, the better. Every day of delay of his departure is a catastrophe in itself. The mere fact that he's still president on any given day is a catastrophe, which will mean catastrophes that people suffer. Now, I shall take an unusual procedure in these remarks because of the nature of the subject matter and the nature of the situation. I'll do three parts. I'll do, in the first cut, a more or less prepared prologue to situate the discussion. Then I shall discuss the crucial factors which we have to consider globally, strategically, to understand the situation. Then I shall come to the concrete situation. I should suggest to you that you walk with me and your imagination and mine as I walk the streets of Manhattan, going to an appointment on Sunday morning, mid-morning, toward late morning, on the famous December 7th, 1941. The streets were quiet at that time, but the silence had an aura about it. And I walked to my appointment, which took place in a hotel across toward 8th Avenue in Manhattan, and I'd come from across Broadway. I walked into the hotel room. There was an awesome kind of silence. I couldn't understand it. And then I heard the voice. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. At that point, everything changed. There are few people still living today from my generation relative to then, of the people who went through that experience in 1941 and the 2 decades or so later. So most people living today really have no understanding or they don't have a reference block, a benchmark in history to look at the events which led into December 7th, 1941, and to understand the events that followed in light of that event. Because after that date, on December 7th, 1941, there was no turning back. History had changed. And it was about soon, within a few years, to change radically again with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. A few hours after that moment of silence on the streets on that Sunday morning, suddenly by afternoon, there was tumult, rising tumult throughout Manhattan. people were rushing to the recruiting offices, trying to find a military recruiting office to which to volunteer. And that was the beginning of a new era. We have such a day as that is really today's date. Why? Because I have announced something, or am about to announce something to date, in which I shall reveal things that are not actually secrets, but they are secrets which are not known to a number of leading people in Russia who were then in power in the Soviet Union, not known to many people in the United States. What I will tell you is most politicians and most military leaders of the United States have no present knowledge of this, except maybe a handful of people who were involved with me at that time. So that's the nature of the present situation. And what I'm going to tell you today will shock the world. It's not unknown facts, but it's largely ignored or overlooked facts, but facts which have shaped the history in which you live. Facts without which you don't know why you're in the situation you're in today. Events of the 1970s and 1980s in which I was a leading figure, in which there was a fight against me on a global scale on this issue, have shaped history up to the present time. And most of you out there have no actual knowledge of these facts, which from the top were shaping world history in that period. But I'll get to that in due course. So, go back to 1971. At that point, a guy who shouldn't have been president of the United States, Richard Nixon, was president of the United States. And on that date, as a result of the events which had happened since 1968, since the end of February 1968. In 1968, the beginning of the end for the United States had come. It had come in the form of the decision imposed upon President Johnson in February and to March 1st of 1968 to sink the dollar. The orders for sinking the dollar had been organized by Britain, by the present Prime Minister of Britain, who had run a Schumpeter kind of operation inside the British Empire itself to sink the British pound. The way this thing happened was you had a president of the United States beforehand, President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had made two fateful decisions which led to foreign circles, including those of Britain, to have him assassinated. There was no such thing as a lone assassin. He wasn't making loans on that day. So you had two offenses. First of all, that you have to remember that John F. Kennedy, despite the negative sides of his family background, had come into the presidency largely through Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his keystone backer for his nomination and election. And under that influence, he adopted the policy of following the image of the policies of Franklin Roosevelt. The first clear manifestation of this in his career was when he took on the steel bosses, which was really Wall Street. Already at that time, the policy of London and of Wall Street was to sink the U.S. economy by tearing down our heavy industry, high technology capability. The first target of this area was Pittsburgh, to shut down the steel industry in Pennsylvania and its auxiliaries throughout Pennsylvania, as a part of tearing down the U.S. economy, as a part of the process of destroying the U.S. economy. At that point, Kennedy stood up. He stood up to the steel bosses, for which they never forgave him. But that was not the reason they killed him. The reason they killed him on orders from London were quite different. The reason they killed him is because he was confronted with the prospect of going into a land war in Asia, in Indochina. There was absolutely no need for that land war. There was no reason for ever going into Indochina with U.S. military forces. Never. Or you might have a few kind of special operations running loose, but not military forces. And President Kennedy consulted on this matter with former General of the Armies Douglas MacArthur, and with the support of other leading military figures, who in concert agreed to the President that the United States must never be engaged in a protracted land war in Asia. At that point, Kennedy stood up against his own administration, his own defense minister and others, and said, no, U.S., a protracted land war in Asia. And he was going to stick to it. So they shot him. And they conducted, with the complicity of a Supreme Court justice, the head Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, on a session where they terrorized the country that the same thing could happen to anyone who got in the way of this policy of going into a protracted land war in Asia. Now, the effect of that land war in Asia was obvious. By going into that war, which was conducted for approximately 10 years before we got out of Indochina, by going into that war, we enabled the British to destroy the United States. By 1967-68, the United States was in negative economic growth and has been actually ever since that time, because our industries were being destroyed. A demoralization, a brainwashing of college students, which turned them into raving idiots, like something out of a Dionysian cult, changed the character of the situation. This destroyed the Democratic Party and led to the inauguration of Nixon. And Nixon proceeded dutifully to do what his masters told him to do, to destroy the United States. That is, to go along with orders from Britain on destroying the U.S. economy. At the very time that Nixon was obliged to support the launching of the moon landing, he was already destroying the capability on which the moon landing was based. From 1967-68, there has been a net collapse of the basic economic infrastructure of the United States, and that has been deliberate. There has been a destruction of our ability to function as a nation. We've become more and more a puppet of the British, from whose sources, from whose monarchy, came the policies by which we have been destroyed. So the sinking of the dollar, orchestrated by the British, to the role of a British Prime Minister, was the beginning of the collapse of the U.S. economy and the dollar as a net collapse. And through a series of steps, that collapse has continued to the present day. Our net infrastructure, that is our net investment in active infrastructure, since 1968 has been negative all the way. That is, we have put up new things in infrastructure, but we've taken down more, either by depletion or taking them down deliberately. For example, in the long term, the destruction of the national railway system was a key step in destroying the economy. By going to automobiles, presumably to build up Detroit, and by destroying the national transportation system, we lowered the productive powers of labor of the economy. And that was done deliberately. Because one of the greatest achievements of the United States in shaping history was the development of the United States from early in its existence, even before it became a sovereign nation, and the development of canals and then later railways. And then the decision based on a great John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State as president and later as a key figure in the Congress, orchestrated the policy and leading way to build up not a railway system, but a transcontinental railway system to unite the territory of the United States as a process from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Canadian to the Mexican border. That was achieved shortly after the death of Lincoln with the completion of the transcontinental railway system. That transcontinental railway system, as already implied in the intention of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, committed the United States to continuing to be a process going away from Europe to the eastern coastline of the United States, deeper and deeper beyond the Ohio Territory, beyond the Mississippi, and to the Pacific, to continue that the destiny of the United States is located across the Pacific in our relations to developing nations across the Pacific, in Asia, and in the Indian Ocean coast of Africa. That has been and should remain the primary international economic orientation of the economic development of the United States, to engage the peoples of Asia in their self-development, to reach into South Asia and to Africa, and to take our tradition of technological and other policy as a way of creating a world composed of perfectly sovereign nation states, no empires, no euros, none of these things, but a sovereign nation state whose individual cultures of individual peoples in individual nations and cultures are promoted. Because people are not potato chips. You just don't batch them up. People are based on their culture, but not just the culture, but the development of their culture as their culture, to reach into the depths of the population, to develop the minds and ambitions of young people in the population in terms of their own language, in terms of their own poetry, or the powers of poetic composition, the powers of creativity, down to the lowest state of condition of the population, and to transform their language into a language of a vehicle of a higher state of intellectual development and culture. And for that, we need sovereign nation states based on sovereign national cultures. But the cultures should have the same ultimate objective and should be oriented to methods of cooperation among different cultures to cooperate to a common end for the common aims of mankind. And that's what's been destroyed. That's what we in the United States, except for some of the bums we have among us, have always wanted, is to have the United States be a lighthouse from which the radiation of the common aims of mankind is broadcast, and the United States to be a keystone of reference for nations which are trying to develop in order to create a better mankind. And that's been our mission. Nixon went the other way. He was the other way already. And one day, when he thought that he was going to resist impeachment, he was never impeached. Wonderful. And that's a lesson for today. We're not going to eliminate Obama from the presidency by impeachment. He's going to walk away from it or be carried screaming away from it. What happened? Well, Nixon got the word that the Senate vote was ready. There was a Senate vote to impeach him. He got the word from his advisors and took this unpleasant news, not happily, but thought maybe his neck required him to take that into consideration. So he volunteered to walk away. And now we've come to a point where we have a president who's the worst president in American history, the most despised president in all American history, most despised by the people of the United States, except for the non-people who like him. And he's going to walk away because if he does not, if he's allowed to retain the powers of the presidency, even in a residual form, he will bring about the destruction of the United States. We're now at a crucial point in our history where that destruction is pending. Every day he's in office is a tragic tragedy for our United States and for its people who are in worsening condition of life as each day passes, for whom there's no remedy. There's fear, there's anger, there's rage. There's no hope for the future. In the meantime, centered on Brazil, there's a looming danger of an explosion of the Brazil currencies. That explosion, which is now pending, would mean a general breakdown crisis of the entire planet. The power of the British system lies in this Nixon thing. What happened? At the point in August of 1971 that Nixon moved under, of course, puppet strings, which moved him, to sink the fixed exchange rate system agreement, which was a residue of Roosevelt's policy, the United States was going to hell. At that point, the British organized a financial cabal centered around a figure called Lord Jacob Rothschild. This cabal is called the Inter-Alpha Group. Now, the Inter-Alpha Group today which is based largely on speculation among Spanish people you wouldn't like to know, into Brazil, around the Banco Santander, but the Inter-Alpha Group as a whole, is the greatest swindle on this planet. And the British economy entirely, financially, depends upon this swindle, whose base of operations is now principally in Brazil. Brazil is bankrupt, totally bankrupt, but it's an oligarchical state in which you have a small part of the population is wealthy and powerful and is able to control things, and the larger part of the population, which hates the smaller part of the population living in other areas, in a state of constant conflict. It is not a stable nation. You wouldn't call it a democratic nation by any choice. It's a dictatorship. And it has certain wealth and certain power in it. But it has a financial system which is a swindle. And the financial system is this Inter-Alpha Group based operationally in London and the chief vehicle of the British Empire. Among its other crimes, as I'll explain a little later, it controls much of the Russian government today. Now with Europe, Western Europe, absolutely in a hopeless situation under the present regime, and with Russia largely controlled to a large degree by the British, who control much of Russia's policy and destiny under British direction, for reasons I shall explain. We are almost isolated in the United States, isolated by having a president like this, and isolated by the fact that Europe, continental Europe, no longer functions. It can be brought back to function as a collection of sovereign nation states, but now it is not a collection of sovereign nation states. It is a collection of non-sovereign nation states. These nations do not have the power to define their own system of credit. They are captives of the British Empire, captives of the same empire that runs Brazil. And Brazil represents a gambling center in world currencies which is bankrupt and ready to blow. If any part of this system blows, and it can blow at any time, the entire present world monetary financial system will not collapse. It will disintegrate in a fashion much like the great Dark Age of Europe's 14th century. So therefore, time is running out. The issue is not a difference of opinion on policy. The issue is a choice of policy between one under which we can survive and one under which we're doomed. And time is running out. Hence, the Ides of March. The President of the United States, the current one, is nothing but a fly floating on somebody's soup. He's of no importance in himself. He's nasty, like a fly in the soup is nasty. But he is not the problem in and of himself. He's the problem that the fact that he's there, that he's not fit to be president, that he's controlled by foreign influences which are our enemy. He does not have the intellect or morals to stop doing what he's doing. Therefore, his presence in the White House is destroying the United States. Not because he has any clear intention. He doesn't have a clear intention. The man is a mental case. But if we don't get him out of office soon, we're not going to have a United States. And that, of course, is my view, the greatest reason not to have him in that office. His very presence in the White House is a threat to the existence of the United States. We can probably find some mental hospital someplace in the world where he can be kept safely or something like that. Or maybe his mental illness is cured. But he must go. That's why he must be impeached. We won't actually impeach him. We'll get to the point where he has to be impeached. And then one ominous day, some gentleman, known or unknown to you, will be walking down a corridor on their way to have a meeting with a certain figure of the United States. And when that meeting is ended, he's going to walk like Richard Nixon. We're not going to wait for 2012. We're not going to wait for later in 2010. We're not going to wait beyond spring. We're now in the time he must go. Because if he does not go, the United States will disintegrate. And that is the best of all reasons for impeaching a president. And the way you impeach a president is not by a vote. You impeach a president by a mass action, a mood throughout the population. As the majority of our citizens today, he must go. And when the people with just reason think that this president must go, he must go. And the way that's done, people who take the role of the Erinyes, the dark angels of ancient Greece, the dark women who come swarming down from the skies to take the reprobate away, will move. And that's exactly what is about to happen. It must happen. And I'm calling upon the dark angels to descend. I'm waiting for the moment that they walk down that corridor, silent-faced, grim, determined. A group of people who can convince this president that he must go. And a moment of silence. And he will go as Nixon went. Not quietly as Nixon went, screaming, shrieking, so forth, like a banshee, but he will go. And that's the way the impeachment is done. Now, people will talk about 2012, or they'll talk about a formal impeachment proceeding toward the end of this year. But that's not the reality. That's the talk. You see, people don't want to say, I'm going to impeach this guy next week. They get frightened. Terrified. But they say, well, he's going to be impeached. It'll take time, yes. But they're talking about impeachment. They're talking about getting him out of there. They're being cowardly about it. They're being sneaky about it. But that's their intention. And at a certain point, that intention, however weak, mild, disgusting, will crystallize. And they will find themselves of having done the things that cause him to go peacefully. On his part, but we'll have caretakers who medicate him and make sure he doesn't do anything damage to himself. So that's exactly where we are at this point. Because, as I said, what is about to descend on this planet now is the greatest crisis in all known history of European civilization. It's coming on now. The fatal illness is in this nation. It has a disease called the president, who's only a symptom of the disease. And that disease will kill us if we don't get cured of it. And 60 to 70% of the American people agree with what I just said. in their own way. They want him out. And they especially, with a special vengefulness, want out every member of the Congress who they think is covering for this operation. The American people do not hate Obama as much as they have contempt for him. What they hate is the members of the Congress who have betrayed them and betrayed this nation on the basis of orders from this president. And therefore, he must go. Now, I referred to the Inter-Alpha group. And now I'm going to get nasty. First of all, what led to the creation of the BRIC was part of the same thing that caused the Kennedy assassination. Remember, the way in which the British Empire has operated is always by wars. And they take people's patriotism and pervert it into getting them to fight wars they shouldn't fight. The best example of this kind of policy, or what your policy should be, was Louis XI of France back in the 15th century. And Louis was faced with enemies all around him. In Burgundy, from London, the Norman influences in London, from Spain, and so forth. And what he did is he avoided war, because they would try to get to war by demanding this and so forth from him, concessions, bribes, and so forth. So he would bribe them. But the bribes didn't cost him much, certainly not as much as a war would cost him. And so by the end of his term as King of France, he had more than doubled the national income of France, more than doubled the income level of the people of France. It made France the leading nation in Europe. The leading France since Charlemagne, for example. And he not only did that, but his example inspired a prince of England, who became Henry VII, to get rid of Richard III and to bring the lessons of the French experience under Louis XI into operation in England. And so the history of an English reform leading toward what happened in the United States came out of France, of Louis XI, through Henry VII. So they took this sex pervert, Henry VIII, and used him to change the policy of England. That led to a whole different kind of history. But that's the way things happen. So we went into, as a result of this process, this change, beginning with, at the same time Columbus was coming to America, we went into a period of warfare from 1492 to 1648. There were very few short intervals in which there was not general genocide warfare. As it was once described by Friedrich Schiller in describing the Netherlands War, men killed men not as men, but as beasts, beast against beast. This was the character of warfare. This destroyed Europe. The Peace of Westphalia created a period of peace. But then the same forces came back. And the beginning of the 18th century, under the influence of Gottfried Leibniz, who was then a key factor in the struggle for a reform in England, Leibniz was defeated, and England went to hell and became an empire of a certain kind. So then in 1763, at the time the British Empire was first established by a treaty in Paris on February of 1763, there was a split in the United States, or what became the United States, between two groups. One group which is tied to the British East India Company, which is we call today Wall Street. Another group is the group that created the United States. We didn't, as Benjamin Franklin intended, throw these guys out. They want to be Brits, they want to be a part of an enemy force, let them go there. Get on a boat. Get, man. Skedaddle. But it wasn't done. So we've had Wall Street, and we've had within us, we've had a sneaky, dirty thing called Wall Street and things like that, which has been a powerful force, always an arm of the British influence, the British Empire inside the affairs of the United States. Now, the British Empire is not a territorial empire as such. The British Empire is an empire of usury. It's a system of financial usury which controls the nations of the world. And that's what it is today. The British Empire is running the world. The British Empire created this president we have through international financial power, imperial financial power, the control of the system, through the breaking of our system, and also through wars, as they did with the Kennedy case, with the 1968 events, and so forth. So we have been destroyed by these forces, partly because we were foolish, or simply because we were small-minded. And always again and again, we have been deceived into going into needless wars. Nobody wanted to go into this war in Iraq. The British arranged it. And they've been out to kill me ever since, because I intervened in British affairs in saying we must not have an Iraq war. But Tony Blair, my enemy, my personal enemy, by aid of the death of a British intelligence officer, succeeded in getting that war in Iraq going. A mess which has not yet been cleaned up and will not be cleaned up for generations to come. We're now going into an Afghanistan war. There's no reason for us to be in an Afghanistan war. There never was a reason for us to be in a war in Asia, a long war in Asia. No reason at all. But we, like fools, do it. We call ourselves patriots when we behave like fools. I don't think being disgusting is being patriotic, particularly if it's also being stupid at the same time. I don't think there should be leaders of government. So that we have Carter, same thing. First of all, we had Nixon. Then we got Carter. Well, Carter was nothing but a puppet. He was owned by David Rockefeller and Company. He was part of the British faction. And Carter ruined the United States, not because he knew what he was doing, but because he knew how to do what he was told. He destroyed the United States. We never got back. Then came along something in this period. And this is the point which you make some extended reference to, which is what I referred to, some things that are considered secret really are not secret to me. Not only secret because I was informed of these things, but because I was an active figure in causing some of these things. In 1975, 76 in particular, while I was running a campaign for the presidency, I had delivered into my hands a carbon copy of a letter written by a member of the Carter candidacy team, the Brzezinski crowd. And what they would announce, what this letter said, is the plan for a threatened nuclear attack on the Soviet Union to be carried out under the Carter administration. Now, some of you who are old enough may remember that I devoted the hot phase, concluding phase of my presidential campaign in 1976 to this issue. Announced that this was the intention of the people behind the incoming Carter administration, Brzezinski and Company, to pull an operation modeled upon what had been done by the British behind Bertrand Russell in launching the original plan for a preventive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, of a plan which was launched officially in 1976, in September 1976. So what I did in this context, in 1976 context, is I went to circles and discussed what can we do in a certain direction. Now, when you get into a posture of warfare, that is, you have declared who the enemy is, and you are arming to have a war with this enemy. that you have declared to be your enemy. You cannot, by simple diplomacy, get rid of that kind of a problem. You could not have just diplomats going in and talking with each other and suddenly coming away, because you've got a whole military establishment, a whole military strategic establishment has been mobilized on either side, in this case major powers, which are organized on the existential intent of sometime sooner or later going to war with each other. In this case, it was nuclear war. So therefore, you have to find an intermediate approach which takes into account the military factor. In other words, your negotiation of peace, if it's going to be effective, must be a negotiation of an intent to peace among the factors which are the controllers of the military establishment involved. So that's the approach I took. I went to people who are in the U.S. military line of command, and into people whose views I shared from my experience during World War II overseas. And we, with our discussions, by 1979, had developed a plan which I was preparing to have presented both to leading circles in our own country and in the Soviet Union. At that time, I knew the Soviet Union was about to disintegrate. Not in the short term, but the process was there. And the war posture and the war burden, the military burden in the Soviet system, was one of the impediments for the Soviet economy. So therefore, if we could define a military-based policy, which would be a policy of cooperation, or intent to have cooperation, rather than conflict, we could, in that way, get out of that mess. That's what he did. Now, at a somewhat later point, at the time that a new president, Reagan, had been elected and was not yet president, I carried this further into actually where people coming out of what was to be the Reagan administration, but in the intelligence community, not the administration otherwise, but through the intelligence community. And they agreed with my efforts. I said, I want to go to the Soviets and propose that we do this. There were all kinds of scientific considerations involved in what I proposed. So a leading section of this, including the head of the National Security Intelligence at that time, the head of the CIA at the time, after Reagan had been elected, agreed. Some of these were people who had shared the same opinions I had back in World War II. I didn't know them then, but when I was in World War II, and they were in World War II, we actually had converging views about the interests of the United States and how to deal with these things. So this became known as a baby I designed. I was involved for organizing leading forces in the French and other military in France, diplomats in Italy, in Germany, in Argentina, and so forth. So I organized what became known as the SDI. The Reagan administration put on the name SDI. But I was the center, the intellectual architect of what became known the SDI, and the pusher of the policy. And a lot of things that happened to me can be explained in terms of exactly that issue. So we went for the program. Significant parts of the Soviet apparatus were engaged in discussions with representatives of the United States and similar circles during this period, including a famous conference which occurred on the tip of Sicily at Erice. Now, everything seemed fine. Then, again, in 1983, President Reagan went on the horn, unexpectedly for some people, but known to the intelligence community, and known to me. Went on the horn and gave a speech, which is his famous SDI speech. He proposed to the Soviet Union nothing different than I had proposed and had been the policy of the effort which I had been making since 1975. I organized it. Now, why didn't it work?
Okay.
Two factors. Principal factor, the British. The British killed it. But how did they kill it? Why did Yuri Andropov, who had British antecedents in terms of influence, why did he summarily, without discussion, publicly repudiate any discussion with President Reagan? Because he was controlled by British agents. Now, the core of this, which became nastier and nastier, was associated with a subsequent successor to Andropov, Gorbachev, who, from my standpoint of objective knowledge, objective judgment, Gorbachev was a traitor to the Soviet Union. And his actions cannot be explained in any other terms. Here's the Soviet Union on the road to destruction. The United States is committed, in terms of the present, in a program which I've designed, which has vast support in France, the military in France, in Germany, and other countries, to go to work and work our way out of a nuclear adversarial condition by a science driver program to go into new technologies which will eliminate the danger from such a military technology. And this guy summarily, Andropov, summarily rejects that when large sections of the Soviet apparatus have understood it and agreed with it. In the middle of the 1980s, it became clear. There were people who technically would be qualified as traitors to the Soviet Union and to Russia, who are today powerful figures inside Russia. They don't represent necessarily the top level in Russia. They represent a very important factor, which is allied to Britain. And most of the officers were trained in Britain. From the middle of the 1980s on, the leading forces in Russia today were trained and directed by British intelligence circles, largely inside London itself. Those people are, in a sense, controlling key positions in Russia today, and are the key impediment to saving Russia from the destruction which threatens to hit Russia today when the Brazil crisis explodes, as it will. In other words, the way this crisis is going now, the general financial crisis in the world today, is on the way to a breakdown crisis, not a depression, a breakdown crisis. There never will be a recovery of the economy in the world anywhere as long as this danger exists. If we don't eliminate Wall Street today, or what is the equivalent of Wall Street today, the United States is not going to exist, and we're going to have a crisis from which no nation will exist as a nation. Will be in decay. So these characters, who are elite, like Chubais, not only Gorbachev, but Chubais and others, who are part of the British school of treason from a Russian patriotic standpoint or Soviet patriotic standpoint, the British school of treason, are behind the major problem we have today. And it's the alliance of that with the British Empire through this group. You have this, you got these creatures here, the brick, you got the, okay. This is the group. Remember, the United States economy system was crashed in August of 1971. In August of 1971, the British Empire, operating through a group headed by Jacob Rothschild and others, created what is called this group today. They are the controlling force today. They are actually rotten, and they are about to crash. This is the center of the bubble which is about to pop. And when this bubble pops, unless we have an alternative policy in place, the whole world's going down with it, like the new dark age. That's where the problem lies. And the problem also lies, Russia, China, and India have a vital common interest, in fact, with the United States, with nations in continental Europe, and others, in revising a new system of cooperation to get the world economy out of this crisis. Largely a nuclear power-driven, transportation-driven infrastructure program, which can be done, it can be financed, and it can work, and it can end this depression. This is the impediment. And the influence of this element, like a pack of traitors inside the Russian system, is the secret to the problem. That is the technical point. That's the point of attack. That's what you must destroy. That's the enemy. Don't pick on everybody you don't like. Pick on an enemy to destroy. Pick on the right enemy and don't attack anybody else. Destroy that enemy. That's the enemy. And it's going to pop anyway. But if that enemy is in charge politically, it will do what was done to the United States under the late Bush presidency in 2007, at a point where we could have organized a recovery from the crisis that broke out, the so-called mortgage crisis, which broke out in the summer of 2007. I had a program which would have stopped it and started a reorganization process. They went in the opposite direction to save Wall Street at the expense of the people, expense of the nation. This is the crowd behind it. This crowd is determined to destroy the United States and to destroy civilization generally. It's a very nasty plan. But the point is, let's don't worry about all the details of the plan. Let's look at the point. How do we defeat this monster? How do we get rid of this monster? How did Russia get rid of this monster? The succubus, which is sucking the blood out of it. With this crazy swindle. Russia has, you have to go through the details as I went through them in Russia back in the 90s and early and later. Russia was systemically destroyed. The design for the destruction of Russia, which occurred after 1989, was already built up in Britain under British supervision by Russians who worked under British direction in designing the problem, people like Chubais, Gorbachev, and so forth, who effectively were traitors to the Soviet Union and implicitly traitors to their own country today, who destroyed the Russian economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union and did it systemically for political reasons. The same group that is out to destroy us. Therefore, we and the Russian people have a common adversary. And we have nations such as China and India who agree with what we should agree with on a nuclear power reorganization of the planet. For going into space, continuing accelerating the space program as a part of the development of humanity, of science and technology, the exploration of nearby space to take care of the needs of future humanity. And this is the enemy. The point in this thing is to understand this. This is the way history works. Not the way the New York Times or the crazy Washington Post says. Not this garbage. This is the way it really works. And has always worked in modern history since the Peloponnesian War in European history. And this is what we must destroy. So British agents inside the Russian system are the same people who looted and bankrupted Russia under British direction. And if you want to find the offices of the people who run the Russian economy in terms of this financial operation, they all are located outside Russia in British territory. The British Empire, it hopes by controlling Brazil, controls the world. And it's coming down. And that's the reality we have to understand. Now, there are remedies. First of all, there is no hope of presuming we get rid of this monster, get rid of this British monster, which has got the Russians under its control. Not all Russians. Many Russians are patriots. Many Russians would want to develop their own country in cooperation with China and India and other countries, with investment in high technology, improvements in infrastructure, which are of mutual interest to us and to the countries of Asia and Europe. We can revive Europe with the right kind of cooperation. Yes, it's a junk heap. It's been destroyed. But by using the techniques familiar to us as Americans in our history, by building up a large infrastructure program, restoring international rail systems, high-powered systems, all these kinds of things, we can use the buildup of that infrastructure to recreate the industries we need to get a full circuit, a full package of economy. We can do it. It's going to take us 2 generations to do it because we've lost skills. Our youth no longer had the skills the same age group had 1 generation ago, not even 2 generations ago. We have destroyed it. We don't have a railway system. We don't have a mass transit system. We used to get clean water out of the faucet in a municipal water system. Now, would you want to drink water out of a municipal water system in the United States today? Would you want to even inhale the education you get in the school today? So we have lost the skills. I think the concrete case, the case of Haiti. And the evil of the Obama administration is typified by its Haiti policy. Here we have a nation which has been destroyed repeatedly by foreign interventions. It's a half island. It suffered an effect of an earthquake, not largely because of the earthquake itself, but because there's no development. And the lowland area about Port-au-Prince is all practically below sea level. The conditions are horrible. So therefore, when an earthquake hits an area which has very poor infrastructure, where the population is unprepared, where 2,000 people share a toilet, I mean, that kind of situation, then you have a real disaster, a deadly disaster, including the outbreak of disease, epidemic disease, pandemic disease, which is what they're now. Now, if we take the Corps of Engineers, they're being destroyed by this crazy lunatic in the White House, we restore the Corps of Engineers, which should be largely one of our greatest military establishment items. The Military Corps of Engineers. If we take the Military Corps of Engineers, if we take our youth on the streets who are being killed by drugs and other things, and if we take them off the streets, as Roosevelt did with the CCCs, the key thing is when you have a slum youth, people living under slum conditions, falling into all kinds of hell, you don't try to organize a program on the streets because the streets control them. The street becomes a culture. This culture of the streets controls them. You cannot make them employable people. You want to make them employable people? Move them to a camp, like a CCC camp. Give them a program of development and work and development and education. What we did is we used the U.S. military, the Corps of Engineers concept, to create the CCC function, which gave us the famous Michigan Division in World War II. Yeah. You take the people away from these streets, which is the streets of the culture of death, of drugs and death, murder. Get them out of there. Give them a future. Give them a birthplace, a rebirth place in work where their dignity and skills and identity is changed. You put them to work under what? Under the U.S. Corps of Engineers. Every major government infrastructure project we need today will be largely run by the U.S. Military Corps of Engineers, which is our tradition from the beginning. West Point was that. The way we built the railroads of the United States was with the military, with the retired military officers. That was the way we began. That's what George Washington was before he was president. You take the people who were despised, who were culturally depraved, and you get them out of the streets of depravity. You give them a new environment with a mission, with a dignity. Give them a sense of pride. And give them a mission of which they can be proud. Like rebuilding something that's destroyed. So you take some people, our young people, no jobs, no future. Give them a future. Their problem is not their lack of a job, but the fact is they have no future. And not having a job is a part of not having a future. Give them a future, a meaningful future. Give them a human identity. We're not monkeys. We're human beings. Human beings, unlike monkeys, have a sense of a future, a sense of future generations, a sense of development. We treat human beings like human beings, not like monkeys. Not the way Obama treats them, like monkeys. And you give them a mission of which they can be proud as human beings. And you put the Corps of Engineers in charge. Let the Corps of Engineers take and employ as contract forces people from our industry, defense industry. People have been thrown off on the streets from jobs of pride they had. Employ them as an engineering force. Give them also a third element, American youth who have no future, and give them a future, achievement, as in a place like Haiti. You take the thing that is important, the thing, not the thing that's easy, but the thing that's hard. But it's necessary. You take it on as an assignment, as a mission orientation. And you instill in the people a sense of culture, real culture, a sense of pride in themselves, a morality which otherwise doesn't exist for them. Let them be proud that they helped to save humanity when humanity was in dire distress. And that's what we have to do. Our job is largely, we don't have industries anymore. Wall Street and Washington have successfully destroyed our industrial capability. We don't have railways anymore. We need a national railway system. We need a national water system. We never developed the river aqueduct system in the West. The whole system of water in the West is collapsing. Our food supply is in jeopardy because we didn't develop it. What we need is large-scale infrastructure projects, government-funded infrastructure projects at low interest rates on government credit for long-term projects, and then use those long-term projects as the mothers of building up the industries which will assist the long-term projects as subcontractors. Devote federal credit at between 1.5% and 2% per annum rates, without funny stuff, in a fixed exchange rate system, and supply the credit which enables the entire structure of the U.S. economy to rebuild itself on the basis of the very methods by which we were built up before. National infrastructure projects, water, power, healthcare, and so forth. Build these up. Now take this national structure, funded by federal credit, federal long-term credit, supply some of that same credit to private contractors who are qualified to use the opportunities created by the pathway of this infrastructure development. Because when you create, for example, a national railway system, think of the opportunities of employment you demand be fulfilled in each of these areas. A large project, a national infrastructure project, a national power project on nuclear power. Do you know how many jobs that will create? Not just the jobs in the nuclear industry, but all the things that are stimulated by the process of building up this industry, this power industry. We have to give ourselves a new moral purpose. And look, we look at Haiti. What's the next thing you think about? Well, what about South America? What about Africa? What about the condition in Asia? Isn't the world filled with problems of this same type where the development of infrastructure is the key to opening up development of not only the areas, but the people themselves, the powers of labor, a sense of humanity. And therefore this is the problem. We have to fight against those who, like the de facto traitors of the Soviet Union, who went to work for Britain among the friends of Gorbachev, who looted the former Soviet Union, Russia and so forth, in the manner I saw, witnessed, willful destruction of an economy from the inside for the sake of the British Empire. And these people who did that in Russia are doing it to Russia still today. And as they did it to Russia from abroad then, they're doing it from Russia from abroad now, because the key control centers of these projects of finance are all outside, largely outside Russia. So therefore Russia, as long as this financial system has Russia imprisoned. And if Russia's imprisoned, then Russia's role in cooperation with China and India, which is crucial, are in jeopardy. If Russia, China, and India are not in a state of cooperation and with the United States, what happens to the future of Japan? What happens to the future of Korea? What happens to the future of Southeast Asia? What happens to the future of Africa? So therefore, the interdependence of sovereign nation states with certain missions which are in their common interest or complementary interest are the way to rebuild the planet. And this is an enemy. They're not merely traitors to the Soviet Union, which is a past arrogance, but they continue the tradition of treason in Russia today. And therefore, what do? We take their toys away. What are the toys? Their financial system. What's the toy? Where is it? The brick. The system, which is the British system. Destroy it. How do we do that? Well, it's a very simple way. Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was the spirit of the U.S. Constitution. It was sabotaged because Bill Clinton had been in trouble because somebody set him up for it. And Gore and company and people like that destroyed it. But Glass-Steagall is the soul of the U.S. Constitution, an expression of the soul. Without a fixed exchange rate system internationally, you cannot develop cheap credit that you require internationally for building up this planet and rebuilding the United States. You can't do it. Therefore, we must do it. But you cannot have different fluctuating values of currencies and do it. Because when currency's value fluctuates, then the interest rates go up to compensate for the fluctuations. Therefore, you need a fixed exchange rate system. Therefore, what do? You have to close down, as bankrupt, all the fake industries, the Wall Street industries. Take it all back. Take the money back. Take the money back not only from 2007, take it back from 1987. And thus, by creating an international system, using the Glass-Steagall standard, which is the only standard that works for this kind of situation and for the future of nations, by using a Glass-Steagall standard internationally and just wiping off the books all the fake money, all the speculative money, wiping it off. Look, you invent in a game called Monopoly, card game called Monopoly. You played Monopoly game with the entire economy, with your crazy money system. The game is over. Now we want real money, real credit. And it will be a system of, not a monetary system, but a credit system, under which the credit of governments, of national credit, under a fixed exchange rate system, cooperation with a mission orientation toward rebuilding the planet, and each rebuilding their own nation, is what we need. Without that, there is no possibility. Now, another aspect of this thing, which is also very touchy, but necessary, culture. People think, mistakenly, that discovery, science and discovery, comes from mathematics. That is not true. It is impossible to make a scientific discovery with mathematics. You can make an uncovering with mathematics, but not a discovery. You can uncover the dirt, and you didn't clean out of the kitchen corner, but you cannot create good where dirt lives. Therefore, you require a productive economy. Well, we're always wearing down the old system of assets we have. We use up the richest concentrations of ore and so forth. So therefore, we have to replenish that. How do we replenish the lost concentrations? By going to a higher level of technology, science driver technology. Well, how do you get science? By mathematics? No. You count the results by mathematics, but you don't get it by mathematics. You get it by the imagination. The imagination is typified by the great classical poetry, great classical art. As in the case of Einstein, whose creativity was associated with his violin. He would take his violin, and he was a Well, he's really a qualified violinist, not the greatest. But he would work with the violin until the moment of inspiration came over him. At that point, he would go put the violin down and go back in the other room and get to work on the real scientific project. All creativity, including classical artistic creativity, musical creativity, classical art, all comes, that's the area of creativity. The problem in our culture today is we make a distinction between so-called science and art. There is no difference between science and art. It's like, males will never cohabit with females. It's a good way to control population, I think. So now, instead of having the idea that it's a natural thing, as it was in former times, for anybody who's an accomplished scientist to also be an accomplished, person, musician or something of that sort. Normal. Because it's in art and classical forms of art that the actual creativity of the human mind is expressed. The mathematics is what sweeps the things up under the rug afterwards. And so we need a classical cultural orientation. Which is in a sense is an orientation toward the human soul. It's where it's located. The human soul, which makes man different than an animal, is the place where creativity lives. And creativity, in what we call classical creativity, always has been the basis for the achievements of mankind. And it's in this kind of thing, it's in this mood, in this dimension, through classical artistic composition and what it represents, where the love of mankind for mankind is expressed. It's expressed by a passion of creativity. Because man is inherently creative. And when man is not being creative, man is not really becoming human, not morally. And therefore the unity of science and creativity and production and progress is what's needed. And it's been taken away from us. But we have to understand the truth. Where do we go wrong? And this case, it should be shocking to anyone who thinks about it. Here we are, all this time, all this talk about Soviet this and so forth, which is what we were sort of raised in since about the time I was born. I was born in 1922. Guess what the Soviet issue has been since 1922? We lived in a world in which that was the big issue. And now we turn around and we find that the key powers inside the Soviet Union itself, working for the British Empire as traitors to Russia, were actually running many of these operations which we thought were the Soviet operations. The British were running them. We were allied with the British who were running the Soviets. As today, our old enemy, the British, that's our problem. That's why we got Obama. We have to understand, we as a nation were created as a unique phenomenon on this planet. At a time that Europe had failed to realize what had been made possible by the great accomplishments of the century, the 15th century, the discovery of science, the launching of science in the 15th century, the launching of classical art in the 15th century. And then again, the progress which was made by the Peace of Westphalia, again betrayed. We in the United States, from Europe, came to this territory to build up a nation based on the objectives of these great reforms in Europe, but which Europeans have been incapable to defend and maintain. So what we brought here was the contribution of the best of European civilization. It started effectively in Massachusetts and activated seedlings of this in other parts of the country, as in Virginia and Pennsylvania and so forth. We created the United States as a unique expression of a distillation of what had been good in European civilization and adapted to other parts of the world with the same view of a cultural revolution of that type. We destroyed that then, largely through Wall Street and British influence. And today we're about to lose everything, to lose civilization, to lose the human race. And the problem of the Obama administration is that it is the embodiment of the corruption by which we are destroying ourselves. Let Obama go where he wishes to. Let him live in peace. But don't have him in the White House. Get him out of there. And also get out of there that kind of lack of consideration for the meaning of mankind, which allowed him to be elected and maintained in office, which allowed the corruption, the vast sea of corruption which is called our Congress. They're not all bad people. They're just corrupt people. They go along to get along. My brother has a disease, I got to get the disease. I got to go along, you know. He's got syphilis, I get syphilis. Well, you know, we're equal. We're like, you know, we have the same program. We meet regularly to discuss it. And we share the same diseases. And we spread them. That's been the Congress recently. It's not that they're bad people. It's just they have some very, very bad habits in politics. So our job now is to by attacking this issue, which 63 to 70% of the U.S. population is ready to demand, and are demanding in their own way, get this thing out of there. Return the United States to its people. Control it by its people, by their conscience. End it now, because the world is waiting for us to do that. Because if you look what is going on, the problems that Russia has, which is practically a colony of the British financial empire right now. The situation of Western and Central Europe, which is virtually a colony of the British Empire. The problems we have in our own country, if we don't solve this problem in the United States, where we have the potential power and the tradition to do it, humanity hasn't got much of a chance. This is our mission. This is the reason for our existence of our nation. Let Obama quietly go away. Take the whole bunch of behaviorist bumps, throw them out, like disposing of the garbage. And we have, even with all their imperfections, we have a residue of people in the federal institutions, in the population, which are perfectly capable of running this thing with a little bit of encouragement. But under the right leadership and encouragement, what we have now, the residue of government, after getting rid of this garbage out of the Congress, out of the administration, out of the whole government, we can rebuild this nation simply by recognizing that we have a crisis, that we have to make reforms, that we have to fulfill the intention on which the creation of this republic was premised. Stick to that. The American people have gone through an evolution of hatred against the members of Congress and their president since this president was inaugurated. It was a conversion to hatred against their own president, but against their congressman who betrayed them. The president didn't betray them. He was an enemy. You respected him as an enemy. He came in from afar, from the outside. We don't know where he came from. But the guy who we elected, the guy we thought was our friend, thought our representatives betrayed us. That's the guy the people hate. Not the guy who came in like an enemy from the outside, but the guy in our own ranks who betrayed the family, who betrayed the nation, and the hatreds against them. Obama, smart thing. You get out of this mess. They hate them. You go safely someplace else. Keep away from the White House. Bad for you. Have fun. Thank you.
Well, he told you it was going to be that kind of presentation. First, as we normally do for these events, if there are people in the audience who have questions, Pat is here, and there probably is one or two others who have index cards on which you can identify yourself and the nature of your question. If you want me to read your question, I will do that, but obviously you have to write it down. If you want to ask the question yourself, you still have to kind of write it down, because we have a lot of questions, and because I'm kind of trying to group things in such a way that there's some cohesion to the program. I will give precedence to institutional questions that have come in from really around the world. But before I ask Lynn the first question, I want to just recognize some of the audiences that are listening. I know that prior to today's event, listeners to one of the leading radio stations in Buenos Aires, Argentina, listeners to Radio Splendid, were urged to watch the webcast. This came after Mr. Larouche was interviewed on that radio station yesterday. I know that the webcast also was announced repeatedly on Radio IDIS in Quito, Ecuador. And as I understand it, there are meetings all over Ibero-America taking place today, in Peru, in Bolivia, and elsewhere. But I especially want to recognize and to welcome two groups that are listening in Haiti. And these are two groups that we know of, although I understand that there may actually be other organized gatherings. One group is comprised of university students who are with the Association of Literary Youth, which helps poor Haitian youth with reading, singing, and study programs. They are gathered in a city near Port-au-Prince, which was also devastated in the earthquake. And also listening is the Movement for the Reconstruction of Haiti, which is a group led by Haitians who are currently based in the Dominican Republic. And they are organizing everything they can for their fellow countrymen. Both groups have been circulating Mr. Larouche's emergency call to save Haiti, and they greeted the victory of Keisha Rogers with great happiness, stating that this was evidence that this world as a whole can, in fact, be saved. So I'd like to extend a special welcome on behalf of LPAC and really on behalf of all citizens of the United States to those groups. Now, the first question that I have for Lynn is a question that comes from a group of academicians and economists that have been tasked to work on various elements of Mr. Larouche's policy. As I think most of the regular listeners to these broadcasts know, these individuals originally started out as a study group that was an arm of the Obama administration. That is no longer the case, but they are still together and with help from private foundations are continuing their work. They have become familiarly known as the Stanford Group. And their first question is this. They say, Mr. Larouche, since the days of Charlemagne, the very idea of nation has had its foundations as a program of internal development in infrastructure. And our study of history would indicate that those programs have always served to increase what you've referred to as the potential population density of those populations and also to raising their standard of living. That idea of what a nation is has obviously persisted over many successive generations. One of the things that we've been discussing here over the last couple of weeks is that essentially, since the end of the Second World War, when they say prior to the end of the Second World War, such projects, which could be defined as rail systems, as waterways, and other such items, were in fact science drivers in their day. But since the end of the Second World War, it would seem that those types of programs were replaced by what we can best discuss as the space program. If America's commitment to that program is terminated, our argument is that it would not only lead to an almost immediate decline in labor productivity, as well as the relative potential population density of the USA, but that in fact it would denote a disintegration of the nation state itself. And we'd like you to comment on what your thoughts are on this.
One of the things we're involved in now with the basement operations and similar things is a breakthrough in recognizing certain things that were actually working, but whose identity was not adequately recognized. For example, mankind everything about mankind is different than the monkeys. The first are apes, or some Democrats. But this difference lies in a quality which we call creativity, when it's properly defined, as typified by creativity leading to scientific progress. Now, this is typified in one of the great developments in science which occurred toward the end of the 19th century, when there was a breakthrough in having discovered the periodic table and gone through a development of the periodic table to a different conception of mankind, which was reflected in things such as the development of what we call nuclear physics, or actually it was developed in the proper term is physical economy, or a science of physical chemistry. In other words, chemistry meant that essentially that we are not taking something as fixed elements and putting them together as in ordinary chemistry, but recognizing there's a process of development embedded in the universe on which man's actions are acting, having an effect. And what we should be looking at is that. And when we talk about physical chemistry, as people like William Draper Harkins and others defined that toward the beginning of the century, we come into the area of the work of Vernadsky in terms of this idea of physical chemistry. And Vernadsky's division of the world among three different categories of existence, all of which are creative. That is, all of them are, there is no non-creative part of the universe. The universe in its so-called inorganic form is creative. It creates new star systems. It creates new chemistries. It creates all kinds of things. The universe is creative, inherently creative. Then you have the life. Life is inherently creative. The difference is that non-living matter doesn't think. It just creates through lawful processes embedded in the universe. Animals don't really think unless people tell them to, and then they disobey. But people are different than animals in the sense that we are also creative inherently, but our creativity is expressed differently. That we don't see ourselves evolving very much. We see some devolving going on, but that's mostly due to certain bad Democrats. But the human race's voluntary role is conscious. It's the process of invention. It also is expressed in classical artistic composition. And it's classical artistic composition together with the idea of physical chemistry as a process of anti-entropic evolution, which defines what goes on with mankind. Mankind has always been creative before we discovered what creativity is. It's the nature of mankind to be creative. It's the characteristic of our species. It's a different kind of creativity than we find in the animal kingdom. But we didn't understand it. Not this way. We didn't understand it from a standpoint of chemistry or physical chemistry. And since the work of Bernowski, Harkins, and so forth, we have a different view. Or since actually the influence of Riemann, a different view. And so we should be understanding what this means. And the current breakthrough in response to this particular question is coming to an understanding of what a higher level of creativity in terms of achievement has brought us, and to make ourselves a willful agent of that rather than sort of like a frictional agent. We do it because it's in us and we like it, so we do more of it. Then we have to ask the question, what is this thing that we like to do which is so useful? How can we understand how to use it better? What's the intention of this tool? It's a nice tool. But what is the tool telling us that we've got to do? And again, the simple problem here is typified by the corruption which occurred, especially after the Peloponnesian War in the history of the Hellenes. If you go back to the earlier period, people like the Pythagoreans, such as Archytas or Plato, you have a completely different mentality than you found after the Peloponnesian War, in the rise to power of Macedon and Aristotle of Macedon. A reductionist view. The reductionist view was called in ancient society by various terms translated into English as the oligarchical model. The oligarchical model was the concept that people should be essentially cattle. That a person should do what their grandfather did and not change. They should not progress. They should not develop. They should leave that to their betters. So you had a condition of peasantry which was tantamount virtually to slavery. And this was the condition of society under the oligarchical model. It was like a British model today. There must not be too many people. Look, we made a big mistake. We've got 6.7 billion people on this planet. That was a big mistake. We've got to reduce it immediately, says Barack Obama's master with his health care program. But we've said, no, mankind is inherently, voluntarily creative. When mankind is self-educated and developed to understand consciously those powers which we have as human beings, which we are using almost accidentally under certain conditions, just because we like to do it, without understanding fully what it is we're doing. And thus, we've come into this business of the space program. Now, the space program was more productive than anything that humanity did. That is, the rate of benefit of new technologies produced by the space program far exceeded everything expended on the space program. What happened is, by government decision, beginning the middle of the war in Indochina, 67, 68, we stopped it. In fiscal year 67, 68, we cut back. And you look at, for example, around Massachusetts, around the Route 128 programs, almost like the Silicon Valley today. Silicon Valley is a desert of has-beens, or has wanted to be. And the Route 128 region became virtually like a Silicon Valley in 67, 68 because of budgetary considerations by the Johnson administration. But still, the thing was going on. And into the 1970s, we were producing 10 cents of science for every penny spent in terms of benefit. Why? Because when we go into very high energy flux density technologies as you have to even think about getting to the moon. The rate of the increase of the productive powers of labor is accelerated, as in no other way, in a general way. We are now also at a point where science is suffering from the heritage of a disease. The disease is called reductionism. Well, it's also called mathematics. It's modern mathematics, reductionist mathematics, positivism. Positivism decided the universe as sort of a granular texture. And that's the problem. The universe is not organized like granular textures. It's not reductionist. It's not dirt. It's actually a cosmic process. But because we accepted the reductionist conception of science, which we associate with Aristotle, or worse, with the followers of Paolo Sappi, that belief, in the case of Sappi, behaviorism, destroys our ability to understand the processes of the human mind and the relationship of those processes of the mind to nature in general, to the principle of creativity or the principle of anti-entropy. So we are now, in the basement, we're now working on a program which has been defined as a subject matter called the question of cosmic radiation. That the real universe is not organized according to a granular, particulate kind of structure, but is organized on the basis of what we call cosmic radiation, away from the reductionist standpoint. But the entire tradition, especially of the positive mathematicians, is against that. So what we are saying now is we look at the space program in particular, which is what inspired this with Sky and others. We're looking at that and say, well, look, let's take this thing. We've been hoodwinked for too long. We've been told that the universe is granulated, is particulate. But it's not. And while we think like that, we're stepping on our own feet. Because the universe is not that organized that way. It's organized much more the way the Pythagoreans and Plato and others understood earlier, before Aristotle, before this modern stuff. And therefore we have to look at this with a different point of reference. For example, human creativity, all these kinds of things. When we get into this area, all kinds of doors fly open. And you realize what this crazy idea has been, which has been, preventing us from doing the things in science we should be doing. So I think the question you're posing as asked, if considered in the light of what I've just said, are put together, you have a key to understanding this problem and the opportunities that it represents. So we have to keep going along this direction. We have to break through the barriers which have been self-imposed by a reductionist method, which is encouraged by this kind of systemic positivism, mathematical positivism. Get rid of it. Free ourselves of it. And look at the universe in the way which the founders of 20th century physical chemistry, such as William Draper Hawkins, or Vanansky, or Max Planck, understood. Go back to that. Look, we've abandoned what should have been our treasure house. Go back to it. We have now created the circumstances where we force ourselves to realize what we have ignored because the teachers told us to ignore it for too long.
Okay, the next question is actually also from the Stanford group. They say, Mr. Larouche, you addressed this somewhat in your presentation today, but we have had an ongoing controversy in our discussions here on the issue of the SDI. Some among us have argued that the SDI, at least as it was adopted by Ronald Reagan, was principally a military policy. But some of us who have looked at this thing for quite some time have taken a different approach. And it is our contention that the SDI has to be looked at essentially as an extension of the space program, but one which has the potential to be a science-driven effort that would increase the quality of life not only for Americans, but for mankind as a whole. It's our view as a group that for the most part, especially since the Second World War, that most of the wars that we have fought have largely been wasteful and have not been wars fought for any particular principle, and that therefore it would be a denigration of the ideas implicit in the SDI to consider them as merely a military effort. Could you expand on this a bit and share with us your view and what you were thinking when you first designed the concept?
Well, this goes back to my childhood. You know, people make mistakes. They think of the world as sort of granulated, is what little particles hitting against each other with sort of a stochastic effect. It's not like that at all. When I think of, for example, if I look at the genealogy of my own family and look at what my mind is shaped to become as a result of the colonization of the United States and Canada. My first ancestors in this country came here in the first half of the 17th century, in Quebec and also in Massachusetts at about the same time. One of the ancestors of note came over in the Mayflower. Others came over in Massachusetts that period. And then, so that when you, and then I look back at, you know, I was my age. My grandparents were born at the beginning of the 1860s. That's a little bit more than 100 years, isn't it? And their ancestors were born, again, 60, 70 years earlier. One part of my family were Quakers, but there was a group of Quakers which were called the Free Quakers, such as James Fenimore Cooper. And his father was a general officer of some rank in the Continental Forces, the American forces. He became the head of the U.S. Intelligence Service abroad at the U.S. branch, James Fenimore Cooper, and was, of course, a naval specialist who he founded the conception of naval warfare as a conception of political conception, and was together with a whole group of people in the 19th century, intermingled with people in France and the Carnot circles, that thing, in Germany and so forth. So when I look at my family background, you've got a very clear picture of what the environment was which shaped what became me. It's rather awesome. So you realize that you are not a product of something that was born physically, like some ape that chose to get smart, or something like that. But you are a product, a conscious product of all kinds of ingredients, especially intellectual and cultural ingredients, which went into the formation of your personality, development of your personality. And what's one of the most important things about this is that when you choose a profession, or choose a commitment which has the effect of a profession, you reach out to those things in your environment, your social, cultural environment, which fits something within this evolution of the United States. And so not only does the environment influence you, but you influence the environment by the way you trace your intellectual ancestry as well as your biological ancestry. And you treat your biological ancestry as an accident, which happened to your cultural ancestry. And that's the way we have to look at these things. So then in the case of the SDI, this is me. I, at the age of 14 to 15, did not accept Euclidean geometry. I just didn't accept it. And I had a good reason not to accept it, because I observed some construction. I said, if this thing is right, then the construction couldn't occur. And it proved that you could not have a positivist conception of mathematical geometry. You had to have a physical conception of geometry. So that changed my whole choice of things, because I made it a fighting issue. So I fought in my whole educational experience and youth experience. I fought for this approach, as opposed to the general so-called Euclidean approach in everything. And that defines the way you work. So therefore, what happened with the creation of the SDI was my conception. I made choices, and I reached out in the culture, among certain professionals and others, in the United States, in various parts of Europe, in other parts of the world. And I became a catalyst to pull together people who represented these traditions in the leading military circles of France, the circles around what had been Charles de Gaulle, leading military circles in Germany, and scientific circles in Germany, which also agreed. Leading military circles in Italy who agreed. Some Soviet circles who agreed also with those things. So what happened is, because I sparked this thing, all these things began to come together through people who identified in themselves knowledge and attitudes which corresponded to this kind of experience. And then when I began to spread this thing, I had people from the former OSS, of the faction which I was sympathetic to, as against the British faction, who came to me and said, hey, we got to work together. So in that sense, what happened was a leading circle, intellectual circle, of the U.S. political intelligentsia, military and so forth, came together around me in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, around this conception of how we could get out of this military bind, called this European, Anglo-American, Soviet conflict. How to get out of this thing. And you can only go at it by going at it directly. You have to say, okay, here's the kind of skills you represent. Here's the way these skills should be used. To what purpose and to what effect? Now, if you want to take the case of a guy who was recruited to this process, which I was involved in, Edward Teller. Edward Teller, at a meeting with the Soviet representatives, which occurred in Sicily, in Erice, defined the purpose of the SDI as the common aims of mankind. Now, if you know anything about Edward Teller and what his reputation is in his role inside the United States over that period, you understand what that means. It was the people in the intelligence community. What was my project? My project was headed under my plan for a U.S. intelligence university. I said, the United States, the universities are no longer reliable. And especially for intelligence purposes, all we have this British influence is coming into our universities. We no longer have American historians. We have, imitation American, British-trained creatures, different species, like baboons from South Africa or something, carrying baobab nuts back and forth. And the people were not historians. They were chroniclers. They would chronicle events and try to make an algebraic positivist interpretation of a chronicle of a series of events, like a mathematical formula. Their standard was that, and they would ignore most everything of importance that they didn't like. It was fake. So I said, we in the United States have a problem. The problem is we used to have historians, we used to have scientists, and we had a list of names I could name, and we don't have that anymore. We need an American university which is dedicated to training historians, intelligence officers, and so forth, which has the competence to define an American interest view through these professions, which were concentrated upon our academic training program of this type. So I wanted another thing to succeed West Point and so forth, which would be the intelligence education, which would produce historians and people with various skills, including a resource from which to recruit intelligence officers who go through this thing with the language skills and so forth that are necessary for an intelligence officer. So I had this plan for an intelligence university. At that point, in this process, the head of the CIA, newly in there, who was a friend of an old friend of mine, we began to run this operation. And it was in that context of that operation as an applied concern to make a change in U.S. policy from the policy that was a trend portraying as policy to an institution which would actually represent what we as a people culturally represent as distinct from Europe. An American intellectual institution, which we were losing. And so out of this, what was assembled in this process was throughout the U.S. intelligence community, or certain elements of it, there was a consolidation of people around this. And then one bright day, the President of the United States, after a January meeting on this subject, decided he liked it. And so a few weeks later, he made a speech proposing it to the Soviet Union. What he proposed was a speech designed by some people who've been working with me and meant exactly what he meant at the time, which is my intention. So when it comes to the intention of SDI, come to me. I'll tell you what it was. And I'll give you the case of, swallow the case of my dear old enemy, Teller, and what he said at Eritrea and so forth. And we won people over who had been on that kick because they were intelligent enough to recognize we were right. And this was the right way to go. Not to go to a nuclear war, but to take these weapons and turn them from weapons into building blocks and get the military institutions of the respective countries themselves committed to this policy. Because what you're going to do in warfare is what you can get the military to commit itself to do. So if you change their mind about what their mission orientation is, you change their objectives. And the problem with most military policy is people go in there for war's sake. They don't think of their objective, their cultural objective. That's why we get into foolish wars which build up the power of the British Empire. Because we go killing each other out of some grudge fight when we should be concentrating on how to build mankind. And in every part of society, in every culture, there are people, and people generally of potential influence or influence, who will prefer that. And what you have to do is recruit those people out of their own convictions and tendencies to combine their effort for what they recognize should be their common interest and to dedicate themselves to making it work. And we came damn close up to the point that the day that Reagan made that speech. We had it. And it was only the intention of the British Empire and people who I personally considered traitors to the United States on this issue, who wanted to continue this conflict with the Soviet Union. And it came from Margaret Thatcher's circles in particular. They did not want peace. They did not want war. They did not want the development of mankind. They wanted things like this long war in Afghanistan. They wanted it as a way of getting people to destroy their own nations and themselves. And if people had thought about it, they would realize the mission they were oriented was a war to destroy themselves and to destroy the home from which they had gone to war.
For those of you who follow the website, and I assume most of you do because you're listening, you'll see that Lynn answered a question from an anonymous California Democrat. However, even though Lynn answered that question and the answer has been posted on the website, we have gotten in more questions along the same line from everybody, from members of Congress, from state legislators, from 4 union presidents, and a whole bunch of others. So I am going to ask that question and allow Lynn to answer it. Before I do so, though, I want to say that I am not asking this question because of the challenge that was put forward by this person, Julian from Hamburg, who is frankly an idiot. And as a health professional, I can only recommend to Julian that he do something about his rage problem, or he is going to end up in the hospital. So the question is, Lynn, as I see it, the Democratic Party is on a path of self-destruction, and I can say that there probably is nothing that more people seem to agree with. He says, if the Democratic Party sticks with President Obama, it's finished. However, if Obama is impeached, it seems to me that there are two alternative paths, both of which are bad for the nation. Either the Democrats will be forced to defend him, which would be disastrous, or his impeachment will lead to a further implosion of the Democratic Party. Is it possible that your call for impeachment and Keisha's victory in Texas based on that call could lead to a purge of the Chicago boys, including the economic team around Obama, which is more of the same free trade crowd, more globalization, et cetera, and actually avoid the national trauma of impeachment? Go ahead, Len.
The national trauma of impeachment I welcome. It's a moment of joy, liberation. You see, the question itself is posed on an assumption. The assumption about popular opinion and Democratic and so forth parties. I don't give a damn about the Democratic Party as such. I'm an American. And my view is political parties should be instruments which further the kinds of discussion and debate and so forth which are necessary to foster the process of deliberation. Arguments are useful. Tough arguments are useful. You want to get at the truth. You cannot be intimidated by the fear that somebody's going to take offense because you told the truth. You have to say, look, this is the truth. Come on. But you don't like it. You say you dislike it. That's your prejudice. And you have a right to your prejudice. It's like saying you have a right to insanity. Because it's arbitrary. You have to rise to always criticizing yourself. Now, the way to criticize yourself in politics is to look at the parties from the standpoint of the nation. Your interest is not the party. Your interest is the nation. I demand you choose. Which? Are you for your nation? Is that your loyalty? Or is it to the party? If your criteria is to go to your party first, you're not a patriot. And that's what's been the problem in the function of the Congress and in the parties. The party should be a vehicle for the expression of a matured view of issues. And an instrument of education. But the objective is the body politic. Look, we have a situation where the Congress has no relationship of accountability to the people of the United States. 63% of the population at a minimum despises the Congress, despises the political parties. Democrats are running around, but they're not calling themselves Democrats, but independents, en masse. So party loyalty is worth nothing at this point. Decency about party relations is one thing, but party loyalty as higher than the commitment to the nation is treason. Because if you put the party above the nation, you are going to commit treason. You will betray the nation for the sake of the party. You will condition your choices to the condition for the party, not for the nation. Well, I'm a good American, but I'm a Republican. First of all, nobody knows what a Republican is anymore, and nobody knows what a Democrat is anymore. It's been very difficult to get a definition of either. No, you have to start from what is good for the nation, and partisanship must be in the process of the dialogue which is trying to bring about that which is good for the nation and for the choice of mission of the nation in the world as a whole. The choice is reason. The party of reason. And the people will go to a party because they think that party is going to do something for the nation, the nation needs. And you'll support that party as long as it's doing that, because it's a mission orientation for the nation. It is not something against the nation or against the other parts of the nation, but it's for the nation. And you have people like, it's like medical care, arguments for people on the health of the patient, differences on the policy for the health of the patient. The health of the patient is what your purpose is, not the winning of that faction fight. And that's where our problem lies. We do not locate ourselves in the fact that we should be concerned, first of all, for humanity. We have tested and proven the conception that the United States Republic, in its constitutional form, is a uniquely superior form of government. Therefore, we operate on those principles of the American Revolution, which are a partisan view of the fate of humanity. And we're sticking to that. And because nobody has ever proven that wrong. Every time we have deviated from it, we've gone to hell. We are not going to betray our country anymore. Because we have, as a nation, our commitment is to humanity as a whole. That's our commitment. It used to be our characteristic. The Americans could be trusted to do something for the people. Our immigration policy of the late 19th century and the 20th century, early 20th century was that. We were for the people of the world. Come here, come here. And that was our motive. And that was right. It was also our motive to use that fact of the cultures which were represented by people coming here to enrich our own culture here, which we did. That was right. We said, okay, but nonetheless, the people want to stay there or there, can stay there. Fine. They should make their own decisions. But what is common between us is this commitment. We are going to discuss and debate for what's good for humanity. In the meanwhile, we're running our own country according to our own standards, but we're going to consider what is good for humanity. And the dialogue will be based on that. There is no substitute for the sovereign nation state and the role of culture as defining a sovereign nation state. That's actually sacrosanct. But the cooperation among nation states, the understanding of the interpretation of differences in practice, policy, that's there. But we have an American policy, but our commitment is to humanity. And we don't want our nation ever to do what's not right for humanity. And this is given to us by this question of the space program. Mankind must, for many reasons, which are too numerous to be elaborated here on this occasion, mankind is committed implicitly toward developing an industrialization of the moon, which is indispensable with the aid of fusion with power to actually colonize Mars. There are an immense number of problems to be faced in trying this, many unsolved, and many incorrect observations and beliefs to be removed. But we know it can be done. We know that mankind is not going to sit on this planet Earth like a sitting duck waiting for some solar catastrophe to wipe the human species out. We're going to move. We're going to extend the human species. We're going to extend its reach. Maybe we're going to find some humans out there someplace. But we're going to extend this. We're going to get the power through relativistic flight to be able to transport ourselves throughout this galaxy. It'll take some time. We're not going to do that in my lifetime, I assure you that. But we're going to do that because that's going to be our intention. Our intention is the role of humanity in the universe at large. We're going to get the power to do that. In the meantime, we're going to do all the other things that go with it. But if we don't have that mission That's why it's important to get beyond this positivist disease and get into this concept of cosmic radiation. Because we know that the nature of mankind itself, the human mind itself, indicates that the present ideas of the organization of the universe axiomatically are wrong. We don't know what cosmic radiation really means yet. We know some things about it. We know that it means a correction against the dirty, ditty-gritty thing that we have now in terms of positivist conception, reductionist science. So we're going to do that. We're going to discover where we're wrong. We're going to discover new principles. We're going to get new powers. We're going to find out how to maintain humanity in an environment we know, such as Mars, which is not really habitable by human beings by our standards today, which means we're going to have to create an artificial environment for human beings in those places. We're going to have a similar problem to be faced on the industrialization of the moon. But we know we're on the verge of breakthroughs which will enable us to begin to discuss these problems. And as long as we're able to discuss these problems scientifically, we're going to be able to solve them. Besides, the important thing is we can live today, if we have a better health system than Obama would allow us to have, we can have people living to 100 years and longer. We can actually prevent the deterioration in old age, which is going on now. That's intrinsically, in principle, possible. So therefore, you're talking about nearly a century of human life for each individual. And what can happen in a century of human life? Let's take the best periods of scientific progress in known experience. What can happen in a century of human life? The foundations of a revolutionary change in the condition of humanity can be achieved. And that's the way to look at it. There's no limit to what mankind can do. That's what a human being is. And that's a principle. So we just have to do it.
You know, as Lynn's national spokeswoman, I kind of always find myself in the position of being the hard ass. And I admit I like that anyway, so it's not so bad. But then we have Lynn's West Coast spokesman, who he gets to do like all the good stuff, the things that make you happy. And I want to bring him up here because he is going to present you with something that I know will make you very happy. Harley?
Got to get Debbie working on her introductions. Well, some of you may have heard we had an election down in Texas about a week and a half ago. And this was an election determined by a process which very few people actually understand, but which Lyndon Larouche has described as a dynamic process of a mass strike. It's a situation where you have a growing number of people who are barely able to survive, have no sense of a future for their family. They're angry, they're frustrated, and they're starting to ask the right questions, like, who did this to us? And is there something we can do about it? Now, the existing leadership in the country, the political leadership, the economic leadership, as Lynn has been discussing, has woefully failed to address this crisis. It's not just incompetence. At the top, there's an evil intent. And so the question is, when is the time that people will be ready for new leadership? And Lynn, a few months ago, said he thinks that time is now. And we made a decision to run 3 campaigns, 3 candidates among LaRouche Youth Movement members to provide that new generation of leadership that's not corrupted by the old ways of going along to get along, but will run campaigns on the basis of principle. And I am honored and delighted, and also glad to bring you the good news, to introduce to you one of those leaders who won the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Congress in the 22nd District of Texas, Keisha Rogers.
Good afternoon. So we waged a hard-fought campaign in Texas, and we didn't just say we must save NASA and impeach Obama, but we said that we're waging a war for the future of humanity. And if you wanted a future for your children, then you were going to stand with my campaign to call for the impeachment of Obama. And we did that very loudly and very clearly. And on March 2nd, the population and the voters of the 22nd District responded overwhelmingly. And this response came from an organizing of the mass strike in the population that said, we want to put an end to the bailouts, we want a future for our children, we want a future for our nation. And as you saw from the response in the vote in the 22nd Congressional District, they didn't just respond to a slogan that said, oh, that's cool, save NASA, impeach Obama, I like that. But people said, as we continue to go to their doors, as we continue to say to them, right now, this nation is in a dire crisis. They said, they looked at their children as they were tucking them in to sleep at night. They thought about what we presented to them and the challenge for their future, the challenge for the nation that we presented to them, and they said, I have to do something. I have to go out and fight. And that's what happened. People got out, people fought. And now, as the campaign continues, we're going to continue to develop that leadership to promote the leadership which is necessary in the population to get people to recognize that right now the new challenge that is being put on us, the new challenge that is being put forth to the population is that they have to determine what type of future that they're going to give to their children, to their grandchildren. And so we have a new phase of the campaign as we continue to go on. And the new phase of the campaign is what Mr. Larouche has put on the grounds, has put out very prominently as the mission orientation for a Moon-Mars mission. And now this campaign, as my friend Skye Shields has very clearly put out, and Mr. Larouche in his new paper has put forth, this campaign has opened up a new phase of leadership in saying that we're now going to move on to development of a rebirth of a Moon-Mars, Mars colonization policy and mission orientation for the country. And so I ask that each of you continue to join with me as we fight in this campaign to provide the leadership along with my campaign and also the campaign of the other two representatives, congressional candidates, Rachel Brown and Summer Shields. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me also say that Keisha did identify the slate of candidates that LPAC is running, but I do also want to recognize another candidate who is a LaRouche Democrat who is running for Congress in the state of Indiana for a seat vacated by Carol Smith. Good luck, Carol. You're going to need it. Okay. Lynn, this is a question actually from another section of the Stanford group. This is actually from the section that has been, they actually were initially tasked by the Obama administration to assess the overall state of the U.S. economy, and most specifically the state of infrastructure. And their question to you is the following. They say, Lynn, you have frequently discussed Nixon's actions in 1971 as the beginning of the end of the current financial system and of the true decline of the U.S. economy. But in fact, our ongoing economic survey has led to a different conclusion. Our study shows that the taking down of the U.S. economy actually began much earlier. In fact, it began almost immediately at the end of the Second World War, or with the death of FDR. And I add that because some people will argue that the decline of the economy in the post-war period always follows the end of wars because of reductions in military production and spending. But we are attributing it to something different in terms of what FDR's policies actually were. But the point is that the decline began then. The downturn was, according to our study, temporarily reversed with the Kennedy presidency, and most specifically the space program. After Kennedy's murder, the disintegration intensified, but was well underway already when Richard Nixon pulled the plug. Are we looking at this the right way? And would you please take a moment to comment?
Yes, it is. Some of these takedowns were crucial in the sense that they were irreversible. Others were establishment of trends which, by failing to be reversed, created this process. The controlling factor in this all along was that the control goes back to long before World War II. It goes back to the assassination of McKinley in particular, in the whole century. Because remember what happened. McKinley was an obstacle to what? Well, McKinley was a patriot. And his successor, who is former vice president, was not, Theodore Roosevelt. The policy of the United States as a nation, from the beginning, in terms of foreign policy and economic policy, had always been based on the issues of 1763 and the split between the British faction in Massachusetts and elsewhere and the patriotic faction. The British faction was the British East India Company faction. The significance of 1763 was not the French and Indian Wars. The French and Indian Wars were a byproduct of the problem. And they have affected the Americans greatly on this account. But they affected greatly because of a greater consideration. The function was the 7 Years' War. Now, we'd had wars before, but the 7 Years' Wars were crucial. What happened, typically, is that the British and the Dutch together conspired to organize a 7 Years' War in Europe. This 7 Years' War, in its effect, destroyed Europe and consolidated the power, not only consolidated the power of the British Empire, the India Company, but the gaining of control of Canada and of India by the British through the course of the 7 Years' War established the British Empire as an empire of the British East India Company. At that point, the British monarchy was under the control of the British East India Company. It depended upon that. It was already an imperial interest. The British Empire was lodged in the imperial form of the system, not in the fact of the British monarchy. The British monarchy became a tool of the empire, but the monarchy did not define the empire. The British East India Company. What was the British East India Company? It was Venice, the Venetian financial oligarchy, which had created all kinds of evil things. So the point has been the British policy was always The British imperial policy was the policy of the British East India Company, which is policy of an essentially Venetian interest. Like a disease. You say, I want to meet your emperor. You're dealing with, say, bubonic plague. I want to meet the big emperor of bubonic plague. I want the big bubo. But no, it's not. What there is a culture. This goes back to a more fundamental question, which most politicians don't even know about. And most historians don't know about it either. Or they call them hysterians for that reason. They don't know what the problem is. But they're excited about it. So anyway, what's the point? What's the nature of mankind? Forget particularism. What's the nature of mankind? Every process in the universe, according to Vanatsky, is creative. The non-living processes are creative. Living processes are inherently creative. Mankind is inherently creative, but it's not the same thing. Mankind's creativity is voluntary and is located essentially in the capacity of the human individual. So we're dealing with mass phenomena, global phenomena. We're not dealing with a kinematic system. And most idiots, politicians, historians, and so forth, are idiots because they think in terms of kinematic considerations. They think of ideas as spread kinematically from person to person. Okay. When most people don't even know why they think what they think. Therefore, what they think about what they think is not a definition of their interest. Nor is it, above all, a definition of their behavior. Mass behavior is not based on individual opinion. As Shelley illustrates in the concluding paragraph of his A Defense of Poetry. What determines all processes in the universe are what the ancient Greeks before Aristotle knew as dynamics, which was revived in the last decade of the 17th century as dynamics. And then you had people got frantic about what Leibniz had done in presenting modern dynamics, and they invented a new name, a new meaning for dynamics, which is commonly used today, but which is worth nothing. It's totally incompetent. Dynamics indicates that the processes that govern humanity are dynamic. They are characteristics of processes, not reactions among things. They are not kinematic in any sense. They're dynamic. In Leibniz's sense. As Shelley describes mass behavior in the concluding paragraphs of his A Defense of Poetry. All human behavior is defined by mass behavior. And the role of the individual lies in the relationship between individual behavior's influence on mass behavior. Mass behavior is dynamic. The individual acts not on one individual and then another and then another. The individual acts on the mass, the process. The relation is not concrete, it's not particular, it's dynamic. And dynamic means not particular. Kinematic interactions among things is not dynamics, contrary to people who don't know any better and say so. So therefore, that's the process you're looking at. Now, human intelligence is dynamic. And the reason that most musicians who try to sing fail, even when they're well trained, is because they don't know dynamics. Dynamics is located in the action of the individual on the process. The process is primary. The individual expresses the conscious element of action of the individual with the process. For example, it is not the validity of ideas that determine what ideas will be accepted. In most societies, what they believe generally is wrong. And the innovations in ideas they make as processes are wrong, destructive. So therefore, the function is the way in which the individual is able to influence a dynamic process. And that's the way this thing works. And therefore, when you have a society which is based on positivist thinking, just think how many people who are professors in universities in scientific and related subjects or any other subject, how do they teach? They teach the individual as an object or as an object in a kinematic process, not a dynamic one. And we know the universe is organized by what? It's organized by principles. But the problem is, in modern European civilization, which is based on Sarpi's teaching, and on the following followers of Sarpi, deny the existence of dynamics. Why? Because, as you should know, every professor of sociology will say there are no principles in the universe, but we adduce from behavior what effects are favorable to our satisfaction, our greed, our lust. Huh? What it does for me. Huh? It doesn't do anything for me. Huh? That's it, isn't it? That's John Locke. That's Adam Smith. That's all of the British school. What dominates our universities today? The British School of Sociology. It's all the same. The disease is British sociology. The disease is liberalism, which is exactly what this means. There is no principle in this society. Why is there no principle in this society? Because the rulers of society don't want it. Because a principle would interfere, like the healthcare case, right? Obama's fascist Nazi healthcare policy, for example. They say it's for the good of the people. We've got to kill more people for the benefit of the people. That's what he's saying, precisely. That's kinematics. There is no principle of humanity. There is no sacredness to human life. There's no sacredness to the right to human life. There's no sacredness to any human right. It's all based on what the mass decides. The pestilence decides. And that's our problem. So therefore, we have the wrong conception because we don't understand this process. That's why we go at this thing on the question of like cosmic radiation as opposed to particularism. But if you think about it, think about how many professors and so-called experts always think in these terms, as if it's a kinematic interaction among individual wills, and there is no principle except what the social process by this statistical process of collisions somehow determines. That the majority vote determines what's right. Well, the majority voted for it. It's right. That's what they said in Nazi Germany. So what's the difference between people who support Obama and Nazis from Germany? None. What's the difference between the British monarchy and the Nazis? None. As a matter of fact, the British monarchy created the Nazis, truth be known. But then the Nazis got it out of control, and the British weren't happy about it. But then they adopted the policy. They killed the Nazis, but they adopted the policy. They said, that's mine. This is my sacred belief. And that's where the nature of the problem is that we have not yet recognized this phenomenon, which is what I'm working on now with the work we're doing. Everything I'm doing, apart from what I do from day to day, is exactly that. This question is to get clear what the nature of dynamics is. What's wrong with positivism? What's wrong with our mathematicians? Why mathematicians are not physicists? They may claim to be, but they're not. And many times I find a problem where a guy says, I'm a mathematician. You mean you're an incompetent? Or you play with yourself too much? You're not doing anything physical. You're playing with yourself for mental gratification. So that's the nature of the problem. We just don't, this is one of these areas where we've come to a time in history where everything that we need to do depends upon understanding the truth about this matter. What is man? What is the nature of society? The real control in society comes from dynamics. It works in an ordinary society in the form of education. What you must do in society is educate the population. What you're trying to educate is not educate them to an opinion, but to stimulate them to think in ways which improves the dynamic which is operating within the society, is what they take into consideration. For example, take a simple case. Let's take the case of Haiti, the case of Haiti today. Right? What we decide to do on Haiti today as a decision, and the considerations that come into place on the question of the Haiti question, whether we do it or not, determines what we are, doesn't it? What the American people do about the crisis faced by Haiti today is an expression of the dynamic. If the United States as a nation rejects Haiti and goes with Obama against the Haiti decision, as it's doing, that is a rejection of humanity. And he's no damn good for that reason. Not that he's no damn good because he does the wrong thing or the wrong action. He's no damn good because his contribution to the dynamic is evil. Because if your politics or your policy does not recognize the humanity of the people of Haiti and the inherent human rights at stake and the need to defend the cause of those human rights as a dynamic in society, then you're evil. The president is evil. Right? So you want to do good, that doesn't do it for you. Are you committed to influencing the dynamic which influences society in such a way that you are impelled to make choices which correspond to what is right? And the problem with the members of Congress today is they don't do that. They have other considerations. I have loyalties to my constituency, or disloyalties to my constituency, is I guess the favorite sport today. So that's the problem. That's the way I would put it. That framework is the most important thing in discussing the question, in particular the question. The framework in which we define what the problems are and what the solutions are.
Lynn, I was going to ask you a different question, but based on your answer, I, for the 10th time this afternoon, changed my order here. But this question comes from someone who is a leader of the Stanford group, but also is a former cabinet member. She's an economist. She says, Lynn, we're taught, for the most part, that any truly intelligible universal principles, and I suppose in that sense, any actual truth, doesn't exist. Now, it would seem to me, in reflecting on it, that it is that very notion that underlies the whole idea of monetarism. And this has come up in discussions of our group in comparing monetarism to what you have called for in terms of a new economic system. But the fact is that monetarism, and that is really what we are all taught, is that reality can somehow be represented by an essentially statistical notion of value and of monetary value. Now, the question that this raises, at least as I see it, is one of mathematics versus physics. For the most part, economists are trained in mathematics. And we are told, in fact, we are ruled by the idea that any economic principle that we put forward must be qualified mathematically. Now, obviously, the physicist takes a very different approach. And one of the things that has become immediately apparent to us is that your triple curve function could never have been arrived at purely from the standpoint of mathematics. Therefore, and please understand, we're not trying to replace you, but we're trying to figure out why it is that you were able to do this when no one else was. And somehow it seems that it is in this area of mathematics versus physics in dealing with questions of economy and of national economy that the answer lies. Would you comment?
Well, of course, the whole mathematical system of economics is a fraud inherently. And it was based on an imperialist system to begin with. And it's against humanity. Now, the question should be, is what is causality? There is no concept of causality in a mathematical economics. Right? We choose one thing over the other. What's the difference? When someone says the mathematical equation, crap, it has nothing to do with it. It's causality that's important. And when we use a financial system which is statistical, it never works. Why? Look, in no case in history, the known history of mankind, has mathematical economics ever succeeded in producing an improvement in the conditions of life. Never. So mathematics has, in that sense, has constantly failed and will always fail. What happens, first of all, look, you have to look at it from the standpoint of chemistry and life processes and chemistry. Well, you have to have an actual science. And there's no science in mathematical economics, none. And the results are always bad, as the case history of the United States since the death of Franklin Roosevelt shows. Always wrong. American history, always wrong. History of Europe, always wrong. We have the greatest perfection of mathematics per se, with no physics in it, which was introduced by reductionism, especially since Alan Greenspan came into power, and these innovations. The greatest freedom of mathematics to test everything without any difference for quality. The result has been the greatest catastrophe in all human history. So any kind of mathematical economics as such has been proven again and again to be a total failure. Now, if you want to say if failure is a success, your measure of success, then mathematical physics is superior. The fact of the matter is you live in a universe which is essentially consonant with what is defined by Vernadsky's conception of the three qualitative phase spaces of which existence is composed, at least experimental area. The non-living, living processes as such, and the human mind. Three different phase spaces. Now, what do? Mankind does not live naturally. Mankind's achievement is to be highly unnatural. I don't want to encourage certain tendencies by that, but that it is unnatural in the sense of the typical ordinary physical chemist who is not is not really a competent physical chemist. What is the physical chemistry of the universe? We have the physical chemistry we identify with the non-living, that is, which has no antecedent as an organized process. Then we have processes which are living processes inherently, or residues of living processes. Then we have humanity, which is not quite the same thing as any other form of living process. So we have the three categories. These are dynamic, they are universal and dynamic. They interact. The universe is a composite of these interaction of these three phase spaces and everything that's derived from it. So now, how do we live? Let's take a typical case of iron. How do we get iron? Well, we could get iron in many ways, hypothetically. But how do we actually get it? How have we gotten it in terms of the 18th and 19th and 20th century? We went to areas where a lot of little animals and plants died. We went and we robbed their graves for iron. Now, iron is all over the planet. It's a universal thing. But why do we go and rob graves to get iron? as around the Great Lakes area. It's one of the great deposits of iron. And we robbed the graves of the little creatures that died there. That's how we get iron. Why? Because the little creatures who used iron as part of their biological process would, when they died, they would have left a concentration of iron in their little dead bodies. And you can go there and say a prayer over them. So therefore we found that the sources of richest concentration of iron ores for us, such as bog iron in a New Jersey swamp, which is where the Revolutionary War got its metal, iron from New Jersey, from the bog iron swamp. So we concentrate on the grave robbing of living processes. And we find that we go and we take the areas which have the richest concentration of iron, which means the least heat, the least coal used up in order to refine the stuff, and we leave behind the things that are not quite as efficient, that consume too much power in order to reduce this thing to a form of usable iron. Now we find out that by doing that, we tend to exhaust the richest resources of various kinds, left behind in the graveyards of various kinds of species. That's how we get them. We have the lithosphere, and on top of this you have a biosphere, which is developing. It selects certain materials from the environment, grabs it, takes it into their bodies, food for this little creature. These things die, and they leave behind these deposits. And you go running around the world to find out what the kind of species was loose in this area, and they will give you the best concentration of this kind of deposit from the periodic table. But then you're using it up. Are you using it up? No, you haven't diminished the total iron in the universe. On the earth, it's still there, still much, but it's now dispersed. It's not in graves you can rob anymore. You have to go out and rob other graves, or you have to take other resources, and you have to get more powerful means of reducing resources in order to make them equivalent to what had been the richest resources of this iron. So the essence of the thing is, for humanity to exist, several things are necessary. Humanity must increase its power, measured in heat energy or heat power per square kilometer, per square centimeter, or smaller. And by increasing our power, by increasing the energy flux density of the power applied, we are able to make poor resources better than what had been previously considered rich resources. To do that, we have to develop infrastructure, a total systemic infrastructure. We have to develop an infrastructure which is able to organize the application of energy, power, in various ways, which makes it possible at various points in the earth to extract economically a raw material from the periodic table, and to distribute it, because you're getting it here, you want it over here. That requires a system of power to deliver this damn stuff. So therefore, you can take the increase of the energy flux density per capita per square kilometer of the planet is a limiting consideration. So now let's look at economics from that standpoint, which is called the science of physical economy, which in its modern form is based on the work of many scientists, especially the followers of Bernhard Riemann, such as Max Planck, such as Albert Einstein, and Vernadsky. That is real economic science. Now then, the other part of it, well, it's not just economic, it's political also. Because what kind of a political system do you have of coordination among people to do all the various things, including distribution, to make this system work? Look at it from the standpoint of Vernadsky. Look at it from the standpoint of physical chemistry as defined by Vernadsky. What do you have to do in terms of human organization of human activity, development of power systems, transportation systems, management in general, to make this work? And to keep society progressing and not deteriorating entropically. That's physical chemistry. Now let's take those standards and let's measure the performance of an economy by that standard, by that yardstick. And you have it. That's the problem. You need a science of physical economy, which means that you do have to consider all these psychological and other things because they involve in the way in which you bring about the organization of the effort society to solve this problem. And it's the same way we're going to go to industrialize the moon, which is one of the easiest chores before us, and how we're going to get to Mars in less than 300 days and end up as a piece of jelly, which would be going to make it difficult to control the machine to get back. So therefore, that is the meaning of economics as it's taught is gibberish. And we know it's gibberish because every time you use it, you end up in bad trouble. So you have to test things by their effects, but you have to choose the right effect. You have to find the time scale on which you have to measure the effect. So there's nothing scientific about what is taught as economics today. What is taught is how to behave to make the bloodsuckers rich.
Okay, I have lots more questions from these Stanford guys, but I'm going to ask some other questions, and we can always come back to them. Lynn, the next question comes from a Mexican congressman. He is from the opposition party, the PRD. And his question to you is this. He says, Mr. Larouche, do you think that nuclear energy is the only thing that can help countries as a source of energy? Or could it be nuclear in combination with other kinds of energy? Right now, nuclear energy is not being discussed for Mexico. No one seems to be talking about it. But we think that it's a very good idea and a very good alternative. For, among other reasons, the fact that it produces large amounts of energy without having any negative effect on climate change.
Don't worry about climate change. Think about dollars. It's not change, it's dollars that count. No, look, we went through this in Mexico in the period of the 1970s and early 1980s. I was personally involved with López Portillo and other people which made an attempted revolution to save Mexico in 1982. We would have saved Mexico if we'd been allowed to. Since the end of the López Portillo government, that October, with his swan song at the United Nations, Mexico has been going continuously downhill ever since, from worse to worser, and worstest. Now, what were the plans, which were not necessarily López Portillo's plans for economic policy for Mexico pertaining to nuclear power, which are relevant? Well, first of all, as you know, the most accessible areas of Mexico are along the coastlines, naturally. And therefore, you would tend to say, well, why, if you want to have an efficient economy, you've got to move the people out of the Dust Bowl or the Smoke Bowl, which is Mexico City area. You know, you sit up there, years ago even, it's worse today, you sit up there and in the morning, the filth is down. So you can get up on the second story or third story, you can breathe air. Down lower, it's more difficult. By afternoon and evening, everybody is struggling. And it's not fit to live in. And yet the people of Mexico, the population keeps concentrating, coming into this great bowl in this mountainous area, more and more population, suffocating and living poor and poorer standards with less and less productivity, actual physical productivity. When you have all this territory of Mexico, most of which is left undeveloped. I mean, it's a territory which is useful. For example, the Mexicans for many years have had this policy of these canals along the coastline of Mexico. Huh? The coastline to canals was freshwater canals. Because the idea is you have the southern part of Mexico is rich in water, and the northern part is rather not so rich in water, much worse. There is no significant railway connection directly between Mexico City and major cities of the northern coast, such as. So therefore, what's wrong? The efforts are going in the wrong place. Now, the problem of going to the coastal areas, if you want to set up, it was planned then. Mexico had a plan for 10 nuclear centers of power production at that point. It was on the plans, it was ready to go. Well, the first thing is the temperature in some times of the day and certain times of the year is not so nice. Not nice for human beings. And it promotes siestas. You know what siestas may lead to? They may lead to sex. And and things like that. So therefore, you don't want too many siestas. You want people working. Well, this means climate control. Now, climate control has many features, which involve things like water. The best way to have natural climate control is to grow trees. So grow trees. Trees will tend to absorb 10% of the solar indicated radiation up to that level. Grasses, poor policy, grasses and bushes 1 to 2% at maximum. So the first thing you want to do, you want to make a more habitable environment, and you don't want solar collectors, nor tax collectors. You want natural collectors, natural control of the environment by trees. Rip up those solar collectors. We need trees. Same thing. So therefore, we would then have, and you would have in buildings and structures, you would have air conditioning in addition to trees. You build forested areas. You have every place you can, you have a tree. You want nice climate control? Have a tree, as many trees as you can get. Find the best ones for this purpose. They're nice anyway to have. They give it, So anyway, so get that. Now you take in areas of work, you control air conditioning. You have water purification. Suddenly, Mexico, areas that are considered unfavorable by sufficient water and sufficient power, because you can handle the power more easily and more profitably along the coastlines than you can in the desert in the interior. Of course, the objective is not to offend the deserts, but to eliminate them. But that's not to offend them, because deserts aren't people. They don't have feelings. Trees may have feelings, but not deserts. So therefore, you want to transform a desert area into a rich area of habitation and so forth. So now you use the areas which are the most profitable in terms of energy policy to develop habitable areas for the Mexicans to get the hell out of that bowl of breathing that stuff they have to breathe every day in Mexico City. Move them out into areas where there's employment, there are decent environmental living conditions, and use the areas which are cheapest for getting this effect because of transportation factors and so forth, and use that to develop the inland desert areas as areas of suitable for habitation. Because the Mexican population has, despite all methods to the contrary, has shown a tendency to increase. I don't know what it is they do, but they do something that they increase their population. Maybe it's a lack of employment. Maybe if they were producing other things, they wouldn't be producing any babies. Right? But anyway, that being the case, that's the point. The point is, you have to have a policy, you have to have a sort of a love of a country, as I do for Mexico. I've been there enough to, and so forth, to get a certain love of the country. So you want the country, like a beloved friend, to prosper. And you want them to not to have these deprivations of undeveloped areas where poor people are starving and suffering with diseases and so forth in undeveloped areas. And that's the policy. The only reason Mexico didn't improve as Lopez Portillo intended in 1982, there's one reason. The British and the Americans said no. They said starve. We don't like you to get too rich. You get too uppity. We don't like that. Mexicans tend to be insolent. We don't like that. You want to work? Go to the United States. You work for nothing? But don't worry, you got work. Huh? Don't complain, you got work. That's the policy, isn't it? Why adapt to that? Why don't we recognize that we as nations, such as Mexico, have an interest in developing the minds of people? Don't we feel ashamed every time we see people dying in poverty in some part of the world, where the poverty is something we've helped to foster because we support policies which do that? Why don't we just coalesce and combine the forces of patriots of various nations to a common cause, to say that we have the technologies available to us to begin to make things better? And why don't we just do that? And let each do it their own way. But let them be smart and also do a little bit of consulting about what's smart to do. That's all. That's the part. The solution is that. Mexico, what did after the defeat of Lopez Portillo, Mexicans became cowardly. It's like that. I can tell you that as of, say, August of 1982, we had a cadre of the organic leadership of Mexico, which was already engaged in a commitment to a program which would have succeeded mightily and would have changed the entire hemisphere from the north, from Canada all the way to the tip of the southern tip of South America. We had it. We had an agreement among Lopez Portillo, among the president of Brazil, among the government of Argentina, and others, to implement a program which I designed. It would have worked just fine. But this came in the period of following the Malvinas War, which the British Empire and a bunch of British butt kissers in the administration prevented the proper action being taken. The United States should have kicked the British out of there. We didn't do it. But anyway, so therefore these political failures, and what happens is people tend to respond to a political failure as if it were a law of nature. We don't dare do that. We don't dare really get insolent about nuclear power in Mexico, because we got our fingers burned once for trying it. And therefore, can't we compromise so the enemy doesn't get too upset? And then we lose. I think the world and the state now, that I'm ready to go to war on this question. We're going to stop losing.
Okay, Lynn, with recent developments in Washington, as you can imagine, we have a lot of questions on health care. But I'm going to take a question which I'll read to you, which comes from a member of the audience, from Ms. White. And she says, Mr. Larouche, I've recently discovered in my reading that concerning the large-scale projects and policies of FDR, that health care reform was included, i.e. the building of hospitals, training healthcare professionals, etc., was included under the banner of infrastructure, and therefore funded under the federal credit initiatives, just as other infrastructure projects and policies were. I found this fascinating because I'm now beginning to realize that this must be exactly where health care should be, instead of the scam of Nazi-type healthcare policies dreamed up by Congress and the Obama easy kill administration. Would you please comment on this?
Well, this policy was partly a reflection of the experience of World War II and also World War I, because the massive warfare of the world wars of that period, which included actually the wars of the 1890s, as well as intermediate wars all over the place. Massive warfare of a protracted type on 5, 10 years, that sort of thing, produced a problem in the wartime period, as in both World War I and II, and in the immediate post-war period as a refraction of that. We in the United States had developed an excellent system, which is the military medical system. It's a part of the medical corps of the United States. This is based on various institutions, including a network of general hospitals. And we had a structural organization of the entire medical care system, generally focused on the medical hospital, the general hospital, on the way down. So right to the battlefield. So you had from battlefield or from just any condition of the troops or the environment of the troops in any area, you had a response pattern all the way up to the general hospital and above. What we did in the post-war period was you look at what Roosevelt did, what Roosevelt's policy was, and you take every county of the United States, like the local combat zone in Europe or so forth of the United States, and you have a system which goes through a chain reaction of institutions all the way up to the top. And the whole thing is a single organism which reacts as a single organism. Somewhere in the system there is the means for dealing with every problem. Somewhere in the system. And we try to make it as efficient as possible. You know, from the standpoint of the AIDS man who was out in the battlefield, who's picking up the wounded from the battlefield and taking them to an emergency station, and transferring them quickly with emergency aid and transferring them to the next place, the next place, the next place, all the way up to the surgical hospitals, the general hospital, and so forth. And it worked. It didn't work perfectly, but the system as an idea worked. All right, so what would we do? With the post-war period, we enacted legislation which is based on this experience. Now, the motivation of the physicians in the military was not money, not under wartime conditions. Money ain't the standard. Getting the job done is the standard. And a little pleasure on the side. And also, they tend to do that, you know. They make up their own entertainment, but that's not built into the table of organization. Actually, the table of disorganization. So that's all there is to it. That's simple. Now, what does that mean? In the post-war period, it means the doctor, you have several kinds of doctors in terms of the doctors. You have the doctor who is independent. How does he function? Well, he functions by relationship to a hospital. And it relates in the Hill-Benton system to the county. Everything is to the county. Every county has a characteristic number of beds which are specified for that county, and the types of care specified for that county. The system is all kinds of things. Who pays for it? Well, the government pays for it. All kinds of things pay for it. But the job gets done. The doctor is independent. Now, what we had is a racket called malpractice prosecutions. First step was to destroy the Hill-Benton system. And that was to go with HMO system. You brought the insurance companies in. Now, instead of having an HMO system, which was 2% override cost for the medical system itself, you have now a system 30% and higher override cost. You're paying mostly for non-care. The malpractice insurance rates were used to jack up the insurance premiums paid by physicians and institutions. So you put a lot of physicians out of business, or you restricted their business to certain things which were considered high-risk areas, which had carried a bigger insurance premium. So the campaign to emphasize malpractice insurance compensation became a racket of the insurance companies, which then earned to loot and destroy the healthcare system. So the obvious thing is clear. AIG makes the whole point clear. Shut it down. Go back to Hill-Burton. Shut down the HMO system. And go back to our wartime experience, which is the same thing for education and every other areas in which state and federal government are involved. You have a need of the society, a universal need. What do? The first thing you do, you set a premium on satisfying the universal need. Health care, education, and so forth. That's universal. Now you decide how this universal system is going to be organized. Who's going to control the various components? And how are these components going to be linked together to get the net result? Who's going to pay for it? How's it going to be paid for? You organize that. So you create a national infrastructural environmental system in which various kinds of private and other interests operate professionally and otherwise to get the job done. Like you want fresh water in your town, the same thing. You want it out of the tap, not out of a bottle which comes from you know not where. Oh, who did it? So that's the basic problem here, is to recognize that the government must operate on the assumption of meeting a mission of government. And a mission of government is something that can best be done by government and cannot be done competently in other ways. What you do is you build this system into the normal functioning of the society, as in the Hill-Burton healthcare system. Private interests of all kinds are involved, and they're completely private, autonomous. But they work on the basis of a relationship which is organized and specified. Everybody has a place to go. If you're unemployed, there's a place to go. If you're starving, there's a place to go. If you've got a disease, there's a place to go or to come to you. It's all organized, which means that we decided that humanity has a universal right to a certain kind of assistance or a certain kind of this sort of thing. Has a right. And we say society's going to provide it. And then we'll work it out. We want the private initiative. We want it. But we want to find a place for it in the system where it can be fostered, promoted. And that's what we lack right now. When we had it, the idea of this, the emergency of the Depression, coming out of this terrible thing. Look what presidency we had. We had a murderous Theodore Roosevelt, a real bum. Woodrow Wilson, a degenerate Ku Klux Klan fanatic, real bum. Coolidge, a bum. Hoover, a bum. We got Roosevelt. Roosevelt died, we got a bum, Truman. Worse than a bum. We got Eisenhower. He was no longer the general in warfare. He was Eisenhower. But Kennedy, they killed him to get him out of the way. Johnson, they terrified into submission. We don't know what, never did find out what some of the other guys were. Poor Carter, he was just a thing that they dangled with. So that's the situation. We've had in our experience as a nation, and we also can borrow some experience from other nations, we have an understanding of how to organize a society as a system. We know exactly why and how we base ourselves at the same time on private initiative. Because we want creativity. We want uncontrolled creativity in a certain sense. There's no restrictions on it as long as there's nothing wrong with doing it. We want it. So we make it comfortable and easy to do that. That's all. There's nothing problematic. Roosevelt was taking us in the direction with his emergency reforms and his intention for the post-war period to do exactly that. Hill-Burton was one of the benefits that came out of that. And those are the models. If we get back to government which recognizes these benefits of experience, we've got a pretty good idea of how to go about dealing with the problems now.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. One is a question from a state official on matters of housing, and I'm asking the question because he is something of an expert on questions of housing, and the other question comes from outside the United States. On the question of housing, Lynn, as you know, I was an early supporter of the HBPA, and the opposition to the HBPA seemed to be absolutely irrational. A different policy was adopted, as we all know, and that policy has unquestionably been a total failure. However, the argument that comes out of Washington is that actually it has not been a failure, and that indeed, during the course of the last month or two, property values have, for the most part, increased. But I have some information that I think makes clear why these people pursued the irrational policy that they did in opposing the HBPA. Today, we are told that there are 7 million homes that are eligible for foreclosure. That number is arrived at by looking at home mortgages that are 6 months or more in arrears. On top of that, there are, as far as we've been able to ascertain, at least another 12 million homes that are 3 months in arrears or more. These homes have not yet been foreclosed on. But it should be clear to everyone that the reason for that has nothing to do with Obama administration policy. And it has nothing to do with concern for those almost 20 million homeowners. The only reason that banks have not foreclosed on these 20 million is their fear of the effect of the introduction of these almost 20 million homes into the housing market and the effect that it will have on property values. This has now become known as the shadow real estate market. And the fact of the matter is that in terms of its overall magnitude, it does indeed pose a systemic risk. This, in fact, is some of the reasoning that went into opposition to HBPA. And it is, in fact, what underlies the so-called success of the Obama housing program. I wanted to share this with you because I think it's another feature of why the HBPA was opposed, and was wondering if you'd like to comment on it.
First of all, I dealt with this in the 25th of July of 2007. The whole system was coming down, I said so, and we signed legislation. Now, the legislation would have worked because the idea was to essentially suspend, first of all, the whole market, real estate market, was highly overinflated. The estimated values of this housing was often far beyond any fair estimate of value. But people have been sucked into it. And they sucked into it on the basis of an easy credit situation. In the same time, we were faced with the fact that the entire system was coming down. And it has come down. But it's come down on the people, not on the normal economy. It's come down on the people. And it was come down because of legislators and governments, with the presidential system, which were thieves. It was a swindle. It was going from a already hyperinflated system under the Federal Reserve System to a more hyperinflated system, which is now in a process of general breakdown. So in a period like this, we come back to human values. I said put a freeze on the whole thing. Just put a freeze on it. Let people buy out and buy properties and sell if they want to, at risk. They want to. But we've got to freeze this thing until we get the economy back in shape where we can have some kind of an estimate of what value is. So we get the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, which is in a sense the intent to reestablish a Glass-Steagall system for the United States. There was no way in which you could micromanage this problem. There's no system of micromanagement that would work. You had to take drastic emergency action. The idea is we're not going to have communities destroyed. We're not going to have families destroyed. We're going to stop it. We're just going to freeze it. And if somebody doesn't like it, fine. But we're going to protect the banks from a repercussion of freezing these mortgages until we can straighten the mess up. So we protect the homeowners and the banks simultaneously. That obviously means the next step is to take a Glass-Steagall standard legislation and just go through this thing and take everything that smells like Alan Greenspan and call it trash. In other words, pare the economy down to what is a manageable level of doing business day to day. Then, having done so to get this thing under control, then introduce a program, which was my older part of the program, was to go back to what I'd attempted to do in saving the auto industry. Right? The auto industry was actually contained the heart of our machine tool capability. There were the aircraft industry and so forth. We couldn't let it go down. These sons of bitches wanted to shut it down, as they have done. I said no. We take the existing auto manufacturing industry. We put it under a certain kind of freeze. We take the floor space and the activity, and we save it. The floor space and activity required to produce automobiles, which we will produce, should be kept in operation, period. Take the burden of the part that is not productive, but is valuable floor space and skill, and townships, cities, townships, and give it a new assignment in what is good for it. What we call the automobile industry before this crowd destroyed it, it remains in 2005, 2006, were communities and productive potentialities in populations and places which historically had been the basis of the wartime mobilization of the United States for World War II. We could make railroads. We made airplanes. We made everything. We made tanks. We made everything. And what was the heart of it? A machine tool design factor. The center of the industry is machine tool design, which goes all the way up in terms of skill, down to the development of the design of the product, which is manufactured and on the factory floor and so forth. We had millions of square feet of empty floor space owned by the automobile countries, which if transferred to projects we needed, like a new railway system, other things, we could done it. They destroyed it. They have destroyed the whole thing. And that's my question. The challenge then was we had to put the whole thing through reorganization. Federal reorganization under emergency conditions. Keep this floor space occupied. Keep these people working. They're going to produce automobiles, we'll produce automobiles on that floor space with those people. The machine tool design people, the other skilled people living in townships here and there who are also associated with floor space, we're going to do projects there which we need. We're going to build railway systems. We're going to build other systems. We have systems we need, all kinds of systems. We're going to build them. We're going to create credit for building them. And building these things that are useful is going to increase the national economy. That's going to pay for doing it. We've got to create federal credit in order to get the credit there in order to be able to get these things to work. Well, these SOPs destroyed it all. and they should be punished. At least they should be humiliated. Huh? It's what we have to do now. It's what the world has to do now. We have all kinds of requirements. China has tremendous requirements. India has requirements. Russia has requirements. All kinds of requirements. The need for development, as in Africa, is enormous. It's all good. All this development can be paid back in the sense that it will be productive. And if it's productive, it means that you can afford it, because it's going to give something to society that you otherwise wouldn't have, which is needed. It's going to increase the productive powers of labor. So do it. That's the business of investment. Do it. Make sure it's productive. And the proceeds of increased productivity will take care of the cost. But you have to have a government system of credit which mediates that process. And that's what we still have to do today. There's no change from that. We have to go back a few years, and everything I said we should have done a few years ago, we go back and do it. And we make the guys who should have done it, who stopped it, do it. They spoiled it, they should fix it.
Okay, the last question comes from Chile. And I think people know that very shortly after the earthquake that destroyed Haiti hit, the largest earthquake ever recorded, as I understand it, hit Chile. And actually, there was another massive earthquake there during their presidential inauguration just a couple of days ago. This question was submitted by Marcelo Rubilar from Puerto Montt, Chile. But it's a question that applies not only to Chile, but gets to some of the cultural issues that Lynn has addressed in general. So I thought it would be a worthwhile question to entertain before we ended. And he says, Mr. Larouche, I'd like you to comment on the psychological effects that populations suffer under extraordinary circumstances, such as the 8.9 magnitude earthquake, which we just experienced here in Chile. What should sane citizens do to try to maintain calm, and from there proceed with some emergency plan to restore a basic economic system? That is certainly what we face now in Chile, but which many people all across the globe face under different circumstances.
Well, first of all, this is a scientific problem, but there's also a general policy question. Normally, and this is a really impressive kind of earthquake scale. But normally, humanity knows this is true of the planet. The planet can produce some very nasty effects. We try to anticipate them and deal with them if we're right, and to fix them if it happens. What's happening now is people are saying there is no money available to develop the resources for dealing with these kinds of problems. So that's the problem. Essentially, it's a different disregard for what should be principles of humanity, principles of development. We're not spending the money. We're not generating it. We don't care. I think the more appropriate case to look at, because it illustrates the thing more clearly than Chile does, what illustrates the problem most clearly is Haiti. What's important is not so much the scale of the shock effect. Well, the important thing is that the level of the shock in Haiti, when taken at looking around the planet at comparable levels of shock, earthquake shock, Haiti is much worse. Why? Poverty, neglect. Look at the case in California. In that case, a comparable case, in a sense, not certainly the magnitude of Chile. But look at it. Look at the number of deaths, casualties, and other things in the California quakes as compared with Haiti. What's the difference? Infrastructure. Therefore, the problem here is we should, when we know we have an earthquake zone, we should anticipate there's an earthquake zone and increase our standards and increase our ability to produce to deal with that kind of problem, to avoid putting people at risk, and to building systems that can withstand this kind of problem. And better research, better understanding, better forecasting, which is still weak. That's what we have to do. That's what we would do. The problem now is that the answer you get is there's no money for this. How can we spend money for this when there is no money for this? We have to pay all this money to these swindlers. And we can't pay the swindlers if we do to fix these things. I have for shutting down the City of London and Wall Street. I think if we have to give up something which is superfluous, something we cannot afford at this time, it is London and Wall Street. We just cannot afford these things anymore. Sorry, buddy, but people come first.